Senhoras e senhores, bom dia. Sejam bem-vindos à Fundação Getúlio Vargas. Meu nome é Jorge Oliveira, sou jornalista, mestre de cerimônias e terei o prazer de conduzir os trabalhos do Seminário Internacional Desafios e Oportunidades para a Agricultura na América Latina. Peço-lhes a gentileza que mantenham os telefones celulares e demais equipamentos eletrônicos no sistema silencioso enquanto dentro deste Centro Cultural permanecemos. Desafios e Oportunidades para a cerimônia de abertura, convido Marcelo Fernandes Guimarães, presidente do Sistema de Informações de Mercado Agrícola do G20, EMS. Enquanto dentro deste Centro Cultural permanecemos. Desafios e Oportunidades para a cerimônia de abertura, convido Marcelo Fernandes Jonathan Brooks, chefe da Divisão de Comércio e Mercados Agroalimentares da Organização para a Cooperação e Desenvolvimento Econômico, OCDE. Roberto Rodrigues, coordenador do Centro de Estudos do Agronegócio FGV, da Organização para a Cooperação e Desenvolvimento Econômico, OCDE. E Eduardo Sampaio Marques, secretário de Política Agrícola do Ministério da Agricultura, Pecuária e Abastecimento, neste ato, representando a ministra Tereza Cristina Correia da Costa Dias. E Eduardo Sampaio Marques. Ouviremos para a abertura oficial deste seminário Marcelo Fernandes Guimarães, Pecuária e Abastecimento, neste ato, representando a ministra Tereza Cristina Correia da Costa Dias. E Eduardo Sampaio Marques. Ouviremos para a abertura oficial deste seminário Marcelo Fernandes Guimarães, Pecuária e Abastecimento, neste ato, representando a ministra Tereza Cristina Correia da Costa Dias. Eduardo Sampaio Marques. Ouviremos para a abertura oficial deste seminário Marcelo Fernandes Guimarães.
Bom dia a todos. É uma satisfação muito grande dar início a esse seminário internacional. É com muito orgulho que a gente inicia os trabalhos aqui hoje. Eu queria iniciar cumprimentando meus colegas de palco. Jonathan Brooks, chefe da Divisão de Mercados Agroalimentares da OCDE, amigo e grande conhecedor e estudioso da agricultura brasileira por mais de 20 anos. Iniciar cumprimentando meus colegas. Bom, Dr. Roberto Rodrigues, Jonathan Brooks, chefe coordenador do Centro de Estudos do Agronegócio da FGV. Amigo e grande conhecedor. Ministro, queria agradecer muito a honra de tê-lo como parceiro nesse nosso evento. É realmente uma satisfação e um privilégio muito grande tê-lo aqui conosco hoje, coordenador o dia todo. Muito obrigado realmente pela sua disposição em estar conosco aqui. E, por fim, cumprimentar Eduardo Sampaio Marques, aqui representando a ministra da Agricultura, secretário de Política Agrícola do MAPA, que junto com a ministra vem conduzindo um trabalho extremamente importante para a modernização da agricultura, das políticas públicas, que com certeza vai falar sobre isso na sua apresentação inicial. Eu queria agradecer antecipadamente aos participantes, aos palestrantes, moderadores, as equipes organizadoras e colaboradores do evento, meus colegas do MAPA, da FGV, que trabalharam bastante, com muito afinco para a realização desse seminário, e aos moderadores, as equipes organizadoras do nosso trabalho, e principalmente aos nossos apoiadores, o Bancob, o Sicredi e o Cicobi. Muito obrigado pelo apoio de vocês, sem os quais não teríamos a possibilidade de realizar esse evento tão marcante aqui hoje. E principalmente aos nossos apoiadores. Na qualidade de representante aqui do EMS, como seu presidente, vou falar muito rapidamente do que significa essa iniciativa, que nós podemos dizer, exitosa do G20, tá? Voltada à transparência dos mercados e à coordenação das políticas públicas, agrícolas entre os países, principalmente em momentos de forte estabilidade nos mercados internacionais, como vivenciamos alguns anos atrás. Dois momentos de forte crise, forte crise na questão dos alimentos e agrícolas, que o mundo não dispunha dos dados, das informações necessárias de forma tempestiva e nem do instrumental para a coordenação das políticas e das ações entre os países principais produtores, importadores e exportadores de produtos agrícolas. Então, aquele episódio serviu como motivador para a criação dessa instituição, que na realidade é uma plataforma digital que está aí há praticamente 9 anos desenvolvendo um ótimo trabalho para ampliar essa transparência de mercado. Para a criação dessa instituição, que na realidade é uma plataforma digital. Preciso aqui também dizer do meu orgulho e satisfação de estar participando dessa iniciativa exitosa do G20 desde o início, são quase 9 anos, e nesse momento ocupo a presidência. Agradecer também a confiança dos titulares do MAPA, que depositaram em mim sua confiança para representar o país junto a essa iniciativa. Faço então aqui um convite para que aqueles que ainda não conhecem o EMES acessem o site do MAPA, que temos aqui, mas eu posso dizer, é www.ames-outlook.org. Vocês vão encontrar muitas informações, análises. Temos uma publicação mensal chamada Market Monitor, traz informações de uma maneira geral sobre os mercados internacionais agrícolas. Eu recomendo, muito interessante. Você tem análises não só dos mercados, mas sobre mercados agrícolas, mas mercado de insumos, fertilizantes, fretes. Dando uma olhada nesse monitor, você consegue ter uma visão muito ampla do que está ocorrendo mensalmente na agricultura internacional. Por fim, dizer aqui da minha convicção do sucesso desse seminário, em vista dos temas extremamente interessantes que serão discutidos e do alto nível dos palestrantes, moderadores e do público aqui presente, que atendeu ao nosso convite, está aqui prestigiando. Por fim, dizer aqui da minha convicção. Muito obrigado, um bom seminário a todos. Em vista dos temas extremamente interessantes que serão discutidos e do alto nível dos palestrantes, moderadores e do público aqui presente, que atendeu.
Agradecemos as palavras do presidente Marcelo Fernandes Guimarães. Ouviremos Jonathan Brooks, chefe da Divisão de Comércio e Mercados Agroalimentares da OCDE. Agradecemos as palavras do presidente Marcelo Fernandes Guimarães.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of OECD, it is a great honor to be here and to be participating in this seminar on prospects for agriculture in Latin America. I'd like to express my thanks to our colleagues in the Ministry and at the Getúlio Vargas Foundation for helping to put this event together, and also to our colleagues in the Agricultural Market Information Service. There are a wide number of countries who came along to the meetings that we've had over the last 2 days, and I think that gives an international flavour and audience to the discussions that we'll have, and hopefully that will be useful in generating a mutual understanding of the issues confronting Brazilian agriculture and Latin American agriculture more generally. I'd like to express my personal thanks to Marcelo for his efforts in putting this event together. As Marcelo notes, I've known him a long time, and in fact I first came to Brazil in 1999. Marcelo was my main contact, and he took me around all the different ministries, explaining all the different departments so that I could increase my understanding of agricultural policies in Brazil. So that's a long and fruitful connection that goes back a long way. And we've also benefited over the years from very good collaboration with the Getúlio Vargas Foundation. I was here for the review of agricultural policies in 2005, where we undertook the first measurement of support that was provided to the Brazilian agriculture sector. And in fact, Mr. Roberto Rodrigues here was minister at the time, so it's fantastic to have his participation and reflect on how things have moved on in nearly 15 years since we came for those particular discussions. Since then, since 2005, Brazil has regularly been included in our monitoring and evaluation of agricultural policies. That exercise now covers not just all OECD countries, but it also covers the major emerging economies as well, including not just Brazil, but also China and India, which, as you know, of course, are hugely important to what is going on in agricultural markets. In Latin America, we also cover Argentina, Colombia, and Costa Rica. In fact, my colleagues Jesus, Anton, and Florence Brassard are responsible for that work. They're here today, and they've been following up on meetings in Brasilia to increase their information on policies as they currently stand in Brazil. The work that we do on policy measurement classifies policies according to their potential to distort markets and trade. And it's sometimes seen as a little bit of a kind of beauty contest. And it's a beauty contest in which Brazil does well. So the Brazilian agriculture sector is relatively market-oriented, and because of that market orientation, when we measure the support, we find that a very low share of support is actually coming from government support in various ways. So whereas the average for OECD countries is nearly 20%, so nearly 20% of the revenue that farmers get comes from either consumers paying higher prices or support provided by taxpayers. In Brazil, whereas that level is less than 3%. So Brazil looks good in that context relative to OECD countries, and the same is true to different extents for Latin American countries more generally. But I think it's fair to note that Brazil, the expectations on the agricultural sector are much wider than simply market orientation, and those are some of the issues that we consider in the outlook production that we put together with our colleagues at FAO. And what we emphasize there is that there's a continued need to invest in productivity growth, to realize economic opportunities, but also because actually you just need productivity growth itself to improve sustainability. The production increase isn't going to come from land, it has to come from productivity growth. So we emphasised the importance of that. And we also emphasised that Brazil and Latin America more generally will continue to be a major supplier of food on international markets and important to global food security. But still, more needs to be done to ensure that production growth is achieved sustainably, to meet climate change mitigation targets, and to widen economic opportunities. So increasingly our work emphasises not just the need for market orientation, but also how countries can improve the productivity, the sustainability and the resilience of their agricultural sectors. One of the key things that we emphasise in our work is that of benchmarking and peer review relative to other countries, so that countries can identify and adopt best practices and learn from each other. Of course, when we come here from outside, we'll never know as much as you about your agricultural sector. So, as much as anything, we're here to learn and to benefit from the discussions that we have with you. If some of what we learn then echoes back to you in terms of information that is useful for your own policy making, I think that for us is our measure of success, and hopefully that is how we can establish our targets and benefit from the discussions today. Thank you very much. If some of what we learn then echoes back to you in terms of information that is useful for your own policy making, I think that for us is our measure of success.
Nossos agradecimentos ao Sr. Jonathan Brooks, da OCDE. Ouviremos o Sr. Roberto Rodrigues, coordenador do Centro de Estudos do Agronegócio, FGV-ESP. Nossos agradecimentos ao Sr. Jonathan Brooks, da OCDE.
Meus caros companheiros,
ouviremos o Sr. Roberto Rodrigues, coordenador do Centro de Estudos do Agronegócio, FGV-ESP,
cuja presidência da AMES nos orgulha muito.
Nossos agradecimentos
o Jonathan Brooks está em boas mãos, temos confiança, companheiros, do trabalho será realizado com a competência de sempre cuidado do Jonathan Brooks, ao OCDE, meu querido amigo Eduardo Sampaio, que aqui representa a extraordinária ministra Tereza Cristina. Senhoras e senhores, permitam-me fazer um especial agradecimento a Getúlio Vargas, aqui do Rio de Janeiro, na pessoa do Dr. Luiz Guilherme Shimura, que nos vai oferecer uma importante abertura desse evento nos temas mais relevantes quanto ao programa Panorama Econômico Global. Esse evento vai discutir, na verdade, o papel da América Latina no cenário global e segurança alimentar, como o Jonathan Brooks de alguma forma já assinalou aqui hoje. E a questão que está no título do nosso evento aqui é Desafios e Oportunidades para a América Latina. O papel da América Latina no cenário. Eu acho que é um pouco chover no molhado falar sobre isso. Já foi dito aqui pelo Jonathan alguma coisa, mas eu vou insistir em alguns temas. Que está no título do nosso evento aqui é Desafios e Oportunidades para a América Latina. A gente tem discutido muito aqui na GV a questão de ausência de líderes globais que sejam capazes de mostrar rumos para a humanidade nos tempos modernos. E essa ausência de líderes acaba também levando à ausência de rumos. Ficamos sem saber para onde vamos, além do que algumas lideranças trabalham numa linha muito subjetiva de interesses políticos ou regionais que não atende aos interesses globais. A ausência de líderes e de definições ou rumos acaba numa linha muito produzindo uma série de incertezas ao redor do regionais, mas uma certeza persiste, não obstante todos esses fenômenos, que é o tema da segurança alimentar. Pode ficar sem automóvel e sem roupa ou sem casa, mas sem comer ninguém pode ficar. Então a segurança alimentar passou a ser um tema dominante hoje nos grandes eventos internacionais e nas grandes instituições multilaterais. A própria ONU, cujo papel principal é a defesa da paz universal. No início desse século, fez um documento mostrando que até 2050 a população do mundo vai chegar a 9 bilhões e meio de habitantes ou mais do que isso, e até lá a produção de alimentos tem que crescer pelo menos 60% para que haja comida para todo mundo e, portanto, haja paz. Porque o que está por trás desse conceito, óbvio, é de que não haverá paz enquanto houver fome. Daí que a ONU se preocupa também com a segurança alimentar para defender a paz, que é o seu problema, que é o seu objetivo. Essa mirada para 2050 tem sido contestada por inúmeras instituições porque é um prazo muito longo. As mudanças que acontecem no mundo hoje são tão rápidas e tão profundas, qualquer previsão acima de 10 anos fica sendo um pouco difícil de se comprovar. Razão pela qual a OCDE e a FAO vem trabalhando já há alguns anos com uma ideia de olhar 10 anos à frente. E esse olhar que vem sendo renovado anualmente, mostra que em 10 anos a oferta mundial de alimentos precisa crescer 20% para que haja segurança alimentar planetária. O que parece trivial, 20% de 10 anos é uma média bastante fácil de alcançar aqui no Brasil, mas não é em termos globais. Estados Unidos, Canadá, União Europeia, mesmo os países da Eurásia, China, Índia, Ucrânia, não terão condições, nenhum deles, de chegar a 20%. Então a própria OCDE e a FAO imaginam que, para que o mundo cresça 20% em 10 anos, alguns países, entre os quais o Brasil, precisam crescer bem mais do que isso, cerca de 40%. E no ano passado, essa visão da OCDE e da FAO foi de novo observada no evento que a OCDE realiza anualmente em Washington, que é um outlook sobre a agricultura para o futuro de curto prazo. E nesse evento do ano passado, o OCDE mostrou mais do que isso, que para que o mundo cresça 20%, países como o Brasil tem que ser 41%, mais até do que a ideia que a OCDE e a FAO vinham defendendo. Isso nos coloca, na nossa região, no Brasil, na América Latina, uma condição, uma demanda que é inédita, vem de dentro para fora. E nós não estamos olhando isso com a necessária clarividência. Não estávamos na clarividência. Isso, felizmente, vem mudando. E é possível que a gente realmente consiga fazer isso, porque alguns temas que deram origem a essa visão nós não estamos olhando isso com a necessária persistência, que são tecnologia tropical sustentável, aqui desenvolvida, que pode ser replicada em outros países, e é possível terra disponível para aumentar a produção e, sobretudo, gente capaz. Nós temos agricultores e empreendedores competentes e uma juventude no campo brasileiro que surpreende em relação ao resto do mundo. Hoje, o Brasil vive uma situação curiosa. No passado mais distante, os agricultores brasileiros, que tinham muitos filhos, porque eram famílias grandes que viviam no campo, sempre mandavam os filhos mais inteligentes estudarem direito, engenharia, medicina, e o menos preparado, o menos inteligente, ficava na fazenda para os irmãos estudarem. Então era uma seleção negativa, havia uma relação negativa. Era sempre pior que ficava na agricultura. De uns 20 anos para cá, isso mudou muito. Há um interesse crescente pela agricultura, até por razões evidentes. O agronegócio brasileiro hoje responde por 25% do PIB, por 25% dos empregos e é responsável pelo saldo comercial do país. E tem sido a grande alavanca do crescimento do Brasil na pequenez que tem o Brasil. O agro é muito mais do que o Brasil vem crescendo. Então, esse horizonte de renda no setor tem trazido para o campo gente muito mais capaz do que no passado. E hoje o que acontece é diferente do passado. Hoje, um pai pergunta para o filho, quer ficar aqui trabalhando na atividade rural? Vai estudar. É o contrário. Antes quem não estudava, hoje quem estuda, quem quer ficar tem que estudar. Então é uma visão diferente, tem trazido para o campo brasileiro uma juventude extraordinária e competente. Eu participo de 25 conselhos diferentes ligados à agricultura, no Brasil e fora do Brasil. Eu passo o tempo inteiro viajando pelo Brasil e pelo mundo. E me surpreende uma diferença flagrante entre o que se vê no Brasil e outros países, sobretudo no continente europeu e na Ásia. Na Ásia e na Europa, quando vou falar em eventos agricultores, eu sou sempre mais jovem nas plateias e tenho 77 anos já. Então, realmente, é um envelhecimento dos agricultores dos países europeus e asiáticos. Aqui, aonde eu vou no Brasil, eu sou sempre mais velho, que é péssimo para mim, mas é muito bom para o Brasil, porque nós temos uma juventude altamente capacitada e que vai entrando na atividade rural com mecanismos de gestão novos, sobretudo uma tecnologia altamente desenvolvida e sustentável. Aonde eu vou no Brasil, com alguns números próprios, um número evidente que eu sei, mas é muito bom para o Brasil, porque gosto de citar aconteceu com grãos, né? Do plano Collor, de 1990 até hoje, por exemplo, a área plantada com grão do Brasil cresceu 60%. E a produção de grão cresceu 320%, 5 vezes mais. Que é a tecnologia que tem uma vantagem, poupou terras de desmatamento. Nós temos, então, que criar uma estratégia fundamental para que o Brasil se transforme, o Brasil e a região toda se transformem nessa liderança capaz de alimentar o mundo e, portanto, garantir a paz universal. Esse é o desafio que nos acomete nesse momento. E o tema tratado aqui nesse evento e o trabalho da AME em relação a informações sobre a real disponibilidade de grãos e alimentos no mundo é fundamental nessa estratégia. E vai passar o tema, por outro lado, por temas como infraestrutura e logística, temas ligados à sustentabilidade, evidentemente, combater problemas que existem hoje. Infelizmente, ainda existem alguns problemas que alguns ficaram muito evidentes recentemente em relação ao desmatamento e incêndio em regiões agrícolas do Brasil, como a Amazônia, por exemplo. Mas precisamos cuidar do político de renda para o campo, precisamos cuidar do político comercial que abra mais mercado. Enfim, há uma longa estratégia desenvolvida. E nós temos um privilégio hoje. Uma ministra da Agricultura, a ministra Tereza Cristina, que tem isso claro e está desenvolvendo um esforço enorme nas direções todas, da infraestrutura, de abertura de mercados, de políticas públicas voltadas para a renda na agricultura. Então, a atual ministra tem essa visão de mercado muito clara e está trabalhando firme e com apoio da área econômica do governo, que sempre foi uma disputa entre a agricultura e a economia, em termos ministeriais no Brasil. E agora não, temos uma sintonia entre a agricultura, a área econômica, a área de infraestrutura e logística, então, o Itamaraty. Então, há uma ação consistente no governo brasileiro, nova, realmente interessante, que nos permitirá, se Deus quiser, e São Pedro também quiser ajudar um pouco, transformar o Brasil num grande produtor mundial de alimentos e ser, portanto, um campeão da paz universal. Esse é o sonho que todos nós no agro temos. Sei também que contamos para isso com o apoio do ICA, que nos acompanha aqui no evento de hoje, que realizará nas próximas semanas um grande evento na Costa Rica, juntando ministros da agricultura de todo o continente. Então, há uma ação sendo desenvolvida e nós estamos nos movimentando para isso. E esse evento é um importantíssimo lançamento dessas ações em conjunto. Agradeço a todos pela presença, pela participação no evento e tenho certeza de que nós vamos sair daqui com uma série de ideias, recomendações que vão alimentar uma estratégia nacional vitoriosa. Muito obrigado e bom trabalho. Agradeço a todos pela presença, pela participação no evento e tenho certeza de que nós vamos sair daqui.
Agradecemos as palavras do coordenador Roberto Rodrigues. Ouviremos Eduardo Sampaio Marques, secretário de Política Agrícola do Ministério da Agricultura, Pecuária e Abastecimento. Agradecemos as palavras do coordenador Roberto Rodrigues. Ouviremos Eduardo Sampaio Marques.
Bom dia, Jonathan. Bom dia,
secretário
Marcelo.
de Política
Roberto.
Agrícola do Ministério da Agricultura,
Compartilhar um
Pecuária
evento aqui com o senhor, talvez a maior liderança aqui da agricultura brasileira que nós temos hoje.
Agradecemos as palavras do
As delegações internacionais, sejam bem-vindos, autoridades presentes, bom dia a todos, presidente da CONAB, diretor do ICA, presidente do Ministério aqui no Rio, compartilhar um evento aqui com o senhor, talvez a maior colegas do Ministério, colegas do Ministério da Economia, outros presentes. Bom dia a todos. Eu trago aqui um abraço à ministra Cristina. Ela está hoje em São Paulo, acompanhando o presidente da República num evento que a presidência está promovendo lá. Então ela tem colegas que acompanhar o chefe, né? Colegas do Ministério da Economia. Eu estou representando a ministra que tem muito apreço para essa questão de modernização, de tomar como referência outros países para testar experiências que não foram exitosas. Ela tem muito apreço por esse tipo de discussão. Eu estou representando a discussão essa que é muito oportuna hoje. Hoje um novo Ministério da Agricultura que trouxe de volta para a sua estrutura atividades que outrora faziam parte da nossa atribuição, basicamente a questão das políticas para a agricultura familiar, as políticas de reforma agrária e de titulação de terras que estavam no INCA, que estão no INCA, que hoje estão no Ministério, o Serviço Florestal Brasileiro, que já fez parte do Ministério como antigo IBDF, faziam parte da nossa atribuição. Então o Ministério voltou a assumir uma amplitude de ação comparável que teve no passado, mais ou menos recente. Então, voltando a essa discussão que temos aqui hoje, é muito oportuna nesse momento que o Ministério está promovendo tantas mudanças, mudanças ou revisões ou atualizações das políticas sobre as quais ele tem competência. Eu, como secretário de Política Agrícola, não posso deixar de chamar a atenção para as mudanças que estamos tentando promover na política agrícola brasileira. Como política agrícola brasileira, que eu estou tentando dar um senso mais estrito na parte de financiamento, garantia de preços e seguro rural. No começo desse ano, governo novo, então os ministros se reúnem, conversam, tem um alinhamento estratégico e nós, junto com o Ministério da Economia, junto com o Banco Central do Brasil, que é uma peça importante nesse jogo, estabelecemos algumas diretrizes para a política agrícola no futuro próximo. Uma delas é que que o foco do apoio público crescentemente tem que ser direcionado aos produtores pequenos. Estabelecemos que não pode mais o apoio público está cada vez mais difícil de conceder no Brasil. A gente tem que reconhecer. Uma delas é que no momento de recessão fiscal talvez sem precedentes na nossa história, que o foco seja concentrado nos pequenos produtores e em algumas atividades que o mercado não atenda adequadamente. Aqui eu vou abrir um parêntese. A agricultura brasileira ficou muito grande para o tipo de apoio que o governo pode dar. O parêntese que eu quero abrir é o seguinte: a Conab, presidente, já anunciou agora de manhã, né, a perspectiva para a próxima safra. São 246, arredondando, 245,8 milhões de toneladas de grãos, um aumento de quase 2% em relação à safra passada. Plantados em 63,9 milhões de hectares. Já anunciou agora de manhã. Outro parêntese dentro do parêntese, doutor Roberto. próximas safras. Porque eu gosto de chamar muita atenção disso. A gente fala que está plantando 64 milhões de hectares de área. Essa área não existe. Nós estamos plantando, na verdade, 46 milhões de hectares de área. E em 18 milhões de hectares, vou dar mais de uma vez, doutor Roberto. Então, estou arredondando os números, tá? Porque eu gosto de chamar muita atenção disso. 18 mais 46. 46 mais 18, né? Então essa área está sendo usada muito intensivamente. Uma experiência nesse nível, nessa ordem de grandeza. Eu sei que outros países também fazem segundas safras ou sistema de double cropping, mas não nessa ordem de grandeza, nessa escala. Então, um exemplo de uso muito intensivo do recurso natural terra, né? Então, essa área está sendo usada muito. E até a terceira safra, onde há irrigação. Isso que eu falei, sem irrigação. Quando há irrigação, e há produtor profissional, é possível fazer até a terceira safra. Mas voltando então, reconhecendo então, 46 milhões cresceu tanto. E até a terceira safra, onde nós enfrentamos essa restrição fiscal, sem irrigação. Quando há irrigação, quando há irrigação e há produtor profissional, o nosso modelo de financiamento é um modelo de sucesso. Mas voltando então, reconhecendo, se você for analisar com cuidado, bastante sofisticado. E até a terceira safra é uma combinação de direcionamento de recursos. A gente tem subsídios públicos, isso é colocado numa cesta e permite que o agricultor lá na ponta tenha acesso ao financiamento com custo compatível. O Brasil sempre foi um país, sempre nos últimos várias décadas, um país de taxas de juros muito elevadas, sempre acima de 2 dígitos. Agora, recentemente, estamos experimentando taxas mais civilizadas. A taxa básica da economia brasileira hoje é de 5,5%, chamamos de taxa Selic aqui. Então, essa taxa mais baixa, reconhecimento do tamanho da agricultura brasileira, sem restrição fiscal, permitiu que o governo, na semana passada, o governo lei do Ministério da Economia, que capitaneou a básica da economia brasileira, mas com a nossa participação efetiva e o Banco Central, apresentasse ao Congresso Nacional uma medida provisória. Aí eu peço desculpas para a delegação internacional, porque medida provisória eu explico depois. Mas é uma medida que o governo põe que tem força de lei. É uma medida provisória, número 897, que trata principalmente dessa modernização do sistema de crédito de financiamento rural. O objetivo nosso, a medida cobre vários pontos. Vou destacar um objetivo, talvez eu pessoalmente veja como mais importante. A gente quer criar um mercado robusto dessa modernização. A gente quer aprofundar, doutor Roberto, medidas que foram tomadas ou foram criadas lá atrás, na gestão do Dr. Roberto Rodrigues como ministro da Agricultura. A gente criou um sistema de títulos que são lastreados em recebíveis da agricultura, recebíveis emitidos pelo produtor rural. Existe um sistema de títulos, overbonds, que hoje são a principal fonte de financiamento agrícola. Já é esse sistema, a LCA já é a maior fonte. Mas a gente quer aprofundar isso, dar mais segurança à CPR, mais liberdade para investir, liberdade para transitar, informação sobre ela, para permitir que o setor privado entre mais decisivamente no financiamento de um setor que é um sucesso. O Dr. Jonathan Brooks falou isso dá mais segurança à CPR, mais liberdade. A agricultura brasileira, relatively market oriented, informação sobre ela é orientada ao mercado. A política agrícola brasileira permite que o produtor responda aos estímulos de mercado, responda a preço. E mesmo com essa baixa, o PSE, em torno de 2%, mesmo assim, a gente não está tendo dinheiro para continuar nesse nível de apoio. Mas o fato é, nós estamos otimistas com essa mudança. A gente espera que realmente a gente tenha uma discussão efetiva com o Congresso Nacional nisso. Eu observei isso ontem, foram apresentadas 349 emendas na nossa proposição. Nós estamos abertos para discuti-las todas elas. Eu quero crer que boa parte vai servir para aprimorar a proposta do governo. A medida não trata só disso, trata de outras coisas, todas girando em torno de crédito rural. O patrimônio de afetação, que permite o produtor destacar parte do patrimônio para oferecer como garantia. Vejo isso com muito bons olhos também, muito importante isso. A questão do fundo de aval fraterno, e tem mais. A medida não trata só disso, pontos incluídos na medida. Eu vou encerrar por aqui. Eu quero mais uma vez agradecer aos nossos parceiros, o EMES, a OCDE, a FGV, a dona da casa aqui, obrigado. Eu quero agradecer de forma muito especial o Sistema Cooperativo de Crédito, aqui o Sicredi, Bancob e Cicobi, que na primeira hora que eu tive uma discussão vou encerrar por aqui, eu quero mais uma vez agradecer o diretor do Sicredi, do Mato Grosso, e falei desse evento, ele se propôs no primeiro momento já a nos apoiar, e ficamos muito felizes com isso. O Sistema Cooperativo de Crédito do Brasil não é ia falar uma coisa, na verdade, mas ele não é tão antigo, mas no financiamento agrícola agrícola não é tão antigo assim, está cada vez mais assumindo um papel de importância no financiamento da agricultura brasileira. É um importante chave no nosso jogo de xadrez de financiamento aos agricultores. A gente tem feito um esforço, inclusive, para que esse market share dos bancos do sistema cooperativo aumente no financiamento agrícola. No mais, é isso. Desejo para todos um bom evento. Chave no nosso jogo de xadrez de financiamento aos agricultores. A gente tem feito isso, inclusive, para que esse market share dos bancos.
Nossos agradecimentos ao secretário Eduardo Sampaio. Com a fala do secretário, está encerrado esse painel de abertura. Quero convidar os senhores, por favor, para que ocupem lugar junto à plateia. Tem a foto oficial. Nossos agradecimentos ao secretário Eduardo Sampaio. Com a fala do secretário, está encerrado esse painel de abertura. Quero convidar os senhores, por favor. Muito obrigado. Ocupem lugar junto à plateia. Anuncio o painel de abertura com o tema Panorama Econômico Global. Para palestrar a respeito deste tema, ouviremos Luiz Guilherme Shimura, diretor do Instituto Brasileiro de Economia da FGV. Anuncio o painel de abertura com o tema Panorama Econômico Global. Para palestrar a respeito deste tema, ouviremos Luiz Guilherme Shimura, diretor do Instituto Brasileiro de Economia da FGV.
Bom dia a todas e a todos.
Panorama Econômico Global.
Primeiramente, eu gostaria de agradecer a organização do evento.
Ouviremos Luiz Guilherme
Oportunidades
Shimura,
estar aqui participando.
diretor do Instituto Brasileiro de Economia da FGV.
Economista que trabalha e a todos, discute e reflete sobre o Brasil, participar de um evento do agronegócio, porque é uma injeção de ânimo, porque o resto da economia brasileira sempre, as notícias não são nada animadoras. No agronegócio existem sempre notícias positivas, o que dá um ânimo, uma esperança. Esse tema que eu vou tratar aqui, economia internacional, o agronegócio, é um tema obviamente muito amplo e eu vou tentar focar apenas no retrato da situação atual. Eu gostaria de, antes de começar a minha apresentação, parabenizar o Roberto Rodrigues, meu colega aqui na Fundação Getúlio Vargas, pelo papel que ele tem desempenhado e a liderança que ele tem desempenhado no setor do agronegócio, que tem permitido à Fundação ter um papel importante na reflexão sobre políticas públicas e que torna muito mais rica a contribuição da Fundação no debate sobre políticas públicas. Vou concentrar, eu não vou, quando discutindo economia internacional, meu objetivo aqui hoje é tentar traçar um cenário, uma visão mais de curto prazo no debate. O que se espera, do que está em jogo, o que está acontecendo hoje, o que esperar da economia mundial esse ano e no próximo ano. Quais são os riscos, tentar traçar um quadro mais dar um pouco de sensibilidade às senhoras e os senhores sobre como eu estou vendo a situação mundial esse ano e no próximo. O contexto que nós temos hoje é o seguinte: o embate Estados Unidos e China. Estou destacando aqui os principais pontos, ao meu ver. O Brexit, como eu estou vendo a situação, taxas de juros muito baixas, em muitos casos até negativas, dívida pública elevada, Estados Unidos, em boa parte dos países do primeiro mundo, ao meu ver, ataque de drones a um campo petrolífero na Arábia Saudita, que abre uma nova realidade. O Hong Kong, China, essa relação, esses protestos em Hong Kong já duram mais de um mês, que não está muito claro para onde vai, o que significa, o que representa isso. E a própria Argentina, talvez do ponto de vista diretamente mundial, o papel da Argentina eu vou detalhar um pouco mais como eu vejo, para onde reflexo no mundo, mas tem um papel importante para a América Latina. No caso do setor do agronegócio, senhoras e senhores conhecem muito melhor que eu, pelo que eu tenho lido, a peste suína talvez seja um assunto de maior importância nesse campo. Talvez do setor próximos meses. Senhoras e senhores conhecem muito melhor que eu. Vou tentar sintetizar aqui a mensagem que eu quero passar, eu vou tentar desenvolver uma narrativa que leve-os a ter esse entendimento, que é o entendimento que eu tenho. Devido ao aumento, devido ao ambiente geopolítico e econômico de elevada incerteza, a projeção para a economia mundial 2019-2020 vem piorando, ou seja, enquanto essa incerteza de alguma maneira não for controlada, tudo que eu mostrei, esse contexto inicial, a temperatura vem subindo em todos esses campos, tanto no embate a China, o Brexit, a situação parecia já complicada e ela vem piorando, por incrível até às vezes surpreende até como poderia piorar. Parecia que já tinha chegado a um limite e continua piorando. A situação parecia já complicada. Minha apresentação eu vou dividi-la da seguinte maneira. Primeiro, vou falar de incerteza. Como poderia piorar. Incerteza é a variável central hoje para se discutir, para tentar fazer uma reflexão do que está acontecendo no mundo. Minha apresentação, a incerteza eu vou dividir em 4 grupos principais. Fraca demanda agregada, eu acho, na minha visão, a fraca demanda agregada é um fator importante de incerteza. A incerteza no comércio nacional, internacional, que é o embate, a guerra comercial China-Estados Unidos, o Brexit, a saída do Reino Unido da União Europeia. E depois vou detalhar juntar em um grupo os outros, vou fazer uma menção rápida a cada um dos outros pontos que eu creio que são importantes, mas não da mesma magnitude desses 3 primeiros. Segundo item, dentro desse contexto, como é que fica o crescimento mundial? O que se pode falar de crescimento mundial? E termino minha apresentação tecendo algumas considerações finais, tentando tirar uma luz de tudo que foi falado dentro desse contexto, discutido. Como é que fica o crescimento mundial? Vou ser obrigado, como todo economista, a fazer uso de gráficos, que nós economistas estamos sempre atrás de dados para tentar, através deles, tirar alguma conclusão, algum entendimento, tornar mais fácil o entendimento do que está se passando. Obrigado, como todo economista, fazer uso de gráficos. Peço desculpas já, as pessoas talvez não sejam tão familiarizadas com gráficos, para tentar que tenham um pouco de paciência. Vou tentar ser o mais claro possível. Tornar mais fácil o entendimento. Incerteza. Com esse crescimento da incerteza ao longo desses últimos, eu diria desses últimos, de 2008 para cá, claramente, o aumento de incerteza, quer dizer, na verdade, até da década de 90 para cá, já começaram a acontecer episódios que levaram ao aumento de incerteza no mundo. Por conta disso, os economistas se debruçaram para tentar construir um indicador que desse uma percepção clara de como é que anda a incerteza do mundo. De tentar, através desse indicador, mensurar, dar uma leitura de como é que anda, como é que se pode comparar a incerteza de um dado momento com a incerteza do momento anterior. Por que essa incerteza para os economistas é tão importante? É o seguinte, como é que eu entendo o impacto do Brexit na economia mundial? Como é que eu entendo esse embate China? Qual é o resultado? Qual é a consequência do embate dessa guerra comercial que está acontecendo hoje? Nós economistas procuramos sintetizar isso na criação de algum indicador. E esse indicador, que foi criado em 2016 por alguns coautores, ele é feito com base em artigos de jornais. Os economistas procuramos pegaram 20 países, selecionaram os 10 principais jornais de cada país e começaram a associar nas matérias desses jornais em artigos, textos, reportagens que tratavam de incerteza, juntavam incerteza com variáveis de política e variáveis de economia. E começaram a entrar em muitos detalhes técnicos como é que foi construído, mas é basicamente isso. Após Após criado o índice, começaram vários outros colegas economistas a testar se de fato esse índice ele tinha realmente algum tipo de... ele estava de fato fazendo algum tipo de aferição da incerteza no mundo. E os resultados foram muito animadores. Então, esse índice de certeza tem um sinal, mostrou de forma clara quão estava de fato fazendo algum tipo de... O que aconteceria no momento da incerteza estar alta? O que aconteceria na economia mundial na medida em que a incerteza crescesse? E ficou claro o seguinte: toda vez que a incerteza cresce, o investimento recolhe, os prêmios de risco aumentam, a empregabilidade, as contratações de mão de obra, elas são postergadas, a inovação também sofre um processo de recuo. Esse indicador, então, já antecipa os movimentos que acontecerão do ponto de vista dessas variáveis que são fundamentais para o crescimento da economia, que é o investimento, a contratação de mão de obra, ou seja, a postura, o animal spirit do empresário, a postura mais agressiva dos agentes econômicos, do setor privado. Fundamentais para o crescimento da economia. Então, tem uma ideia? O índice, se nós formos pegar os eventos que aconteceram ao longo desses importantes eventos que aconteceram ao longo de 97 para cá, esse índice ele começa a ser medido em 97, de 2016, mas foi retropolado para 1997. Nós observamos, para 11 de setembro, temos um pico ali em 11 de setembro, certeza. Invasão do Iraque, outro pico. Crise financeira global ali, foi a quebra da Lehman Brothers, no final de 2008, pico maior ainda. 11 de setembro, Brexit, temos um pico ali lá em cima, certeza. Olha onde nós estamos. Invasão do Iraque, nível de incerteza que nós estamos hoje. Ou seja, situações de incerteza, como foi 11 de setembro, como foi a invasão do Iraque, como foi crise financeira global, pequena, a situação da incerteza naquela época era muito pequena, era vista como muito pequena em relação ao que é hoje. Hoje, a própria saída do Brexit e na sequência a eleição do Trump, também está muito abaixo da situação que nós temos hoje de incerteza. Então, esse dado preocupa sobremaneira. Hoje, a própria saída do Brexit nos permite fazer uma comparação intertemporal e verificar que a incerteza no mundo nunca teve tão grande. Pelo menos de 97 para cá. Da situação que nós temos hoje de incerteza. Então, esse dado preocupa. Vou tentar agora descobrir, levantar, nos permite fazer uma comparação afetando essa incerteza. Que a incerteza no mundo nunca teve tão grande. No meu modo de ver, está levando essa incerteza a níveis tão elevados. Só para reforçar o ponto, na guerra por exemplo, no 11 de setembro, no ataque às Torres Gêmeas, o índice não chegava a 200. Hoje o índice está em 350. No meu modo de ver, chegou quase que dobrou. Só para reforçar, enfim, na guerra por exemplo, no 11 de setembro, começar falando da fraca demanda agregada. O índice não chegava a 200. Hoje, senhoras e senhores, o que é essa fraca demanda agregada? É um fator importante de incerteza. Só para reforçar, enfim. Começo dizendo o seguinte: há um excesso de poupança no mundo. Começar falando da fraca. De onde vem esse excesso? Por que eu digo, gente, que é um excesso de poupança no mundo? O excesso de poupança, ele vem pela própria demografia. Começa pela demografia. Como a população está envelhecendo, está vivendo muito mais tempo, isso força com que as pessoas poupem mais. É inexorável. A idade laborativa não está crescendo, não está se estendendo tanto assim, mas a sobrevida após a aposentadoria está crescendo muito. O que é extremamente positivo, evidentemente, mas força cada um individualmente a aumentar, se preocupar com a sua poupança. E por conta disso, esse aumento de poupança, esse aumento de interesse em ter dinheiro guardado, faz com que sobre muito dinheiro, e o investimento precisa crescer na mesma proporção. Mas a poupança hoje ela está muito alta por conta dessa situação demográfica. E a demografia também tem um outro aspecto perverso, que sobre muito ponto de vista desse desequilíbrio entre poupança e investimento, porque como o mundo está envelhecendo e também estão nascendo menos pessoas, e a demografia também tem um outro aspecto perverso. O investimento em construção civil também passa a ser menos necessário. Antigamente, com a população crescendo, muitos jovens, a necessidade de construir novas moradias era muito maior do que é hoje. Estou falando basicamente do primeiro mundo, tá? Porque essa questão é central no primeiro mundo. Também passa a ser menos outros fatores. O próprio custo de capital hoje a compra de uma máquina é relativamente muito mais barata do que já foi no passado, o que faz com que o investimento, de novo, fique relativamente mais barato do que era. Então, é um conjunto de fatores que levam a que haja um excesso de poupança no mundo. E por que isso é importante? Muito mais barata do que a taxa de juros inexoravelmente faz com que o investimento, de novo, fique mais dinheiro sobrando. Então, o investimento que leva para atrair tanto investimento, a taxa de juros tem que cair. Então, nós vemos aqui de 90 para cá como é que esse processo vem ocorrendo. Uma queda expressiva das taxas de juros no primeiro mundo. Aí estou pegando os países Estados Unidos, Alemanha, Reino Unido e Japão. Está claríssima a tendência de queda da década de 90 para cá. Vem ocorrendo uma queda. E o que, obviamente, agrava mais a situação. Aí estou pegando uma pessoa hoje que sabe que vai viver mais tempo, e Japão, está claríssima a tendência de queda. Já teria que poupar mais. Com o juro caindo, ele tem que poupar mais ainda, porque a remuneração na poupança que ele faz, hoje, a taxa de juros que remunera a poupança dele é menor ainda, o que torna a situação mais complicada ainda para mais complicada no sentido da necessidade de aumentar a poupança da classe trabalhadora. Hoje, a taxa de juros que remunera a poupança dele é menor ainda. No período mais recente, eu quero pegar de 2018 para cá, porque é uma coisa de curto prazo, é uma questão estrutural. Eu quero entrar numa questão mais conjuntural do que aconteceu recentemente. Mais recentemente, a política monetária tem sido ativa. Por que isso? Nós pegamos aqui o juro que é de julho de 2018 até hoje. Como é que o juro cai? O juro nominal cai. A juros nominal de 10 anos cai nesses principais países do primeiro mundo e chega a taxa de juros negativa. A taxa de juros negativa, 10 anos atrás, se alguém falasse isso, era um motivo de chacota. Hoje é uma realidade o juro nominal negativo. Estou falando de juro nominal negativo. Está acontecendo no mundo. Mas por que esse fato está se dando agora com tanta intensidade? Se alguém falasse isso, são os governos tentando forçar a economia a reagir. Porque quanto mais baixo o juro, mais incentivo tem para se investir. Então, os próprios governantes têm incentivado, têm procurado usar os juros nominais, a queda do juro, para forçar uma reação da economia. E isso fez com que então, o que acontece aí, os juros nominais, nesses inúmeros países, esse dado é de setembro, média de setembro de 2019. Juro negativo, ou seja, a pessoa aplica um recurso 100 euros, por exemplo, na Suíça, ele vai pegar daqui a 10 anos, ele recolhe 99,15 euros. Ou seja, ele perde, ele recebe menos dinheiro. Parece um paradoxo, mas está acontecendo. E o mais assustador de tudo, vocês poderiam comentar o seguinte: daqui a 10 anos, tudo bem, mas um caso ou outro, uma coisa talvez inexpressiva. 17 trilhões de dólares são investidos em ativos com retornos negativos hoje, ou seja, 27% do mercado mundial de títulos, tudo bem, mas um caso ou outro, estão sendo remunerados a taxas negativas. 17 trilhões de dólares. Para onde vai isso? O que significa isso? Não só pela remuneração, mas você chegar a uma situação em que você não tem mais política monetária, porque dá para cair mais o juro? Para quanto esse juro pode cair mais? Chegou no limite. É difícil acreditar que dá para ir abaixo disso. Já chegar nisso já era surpresa. Abaixo disso, então, daqui a pouco as pessoas vão pegar caminhões e botar tudo guardado embaixo do colchão, etc. Porque com um juro negativo dessa forma, monta um bunker guardando dinheiro. Coisas que já chegar nisso já era surpresa. Abaixo disso, então. Agora, o outro lado da moeda. Temos a política monetária. Vamos para a política fiscal, que os governos têm executado, no primeiro mundo, principalmente, mas pegando o mundo como um todo. O que tem sido feito em termos de política fiscal? Agora, o outro lado política fiscal, dado que o setor privado não está atuando, não está investindo quanto se esperaria para provocar a economia, para impulsionar a economia, pegando o mundo como o governo pode agir trabalhando, gastando dinheiro, ele próprio fazendo investimento. Isso aqui é um mapa do mundo, um mapa de calor do mundo, em 2008, a dívida bruta no mundo. Se esperaria para podem perceber o seguinte, à medida que vai se aproximando do vermelho, a dívida vai crescendo. Então, são os países aqui. Então, quanto mais vermelho, mais endividado o país está. Sendo que o vermelhão, o vermelho mais forte, é acima de 100% vai se aproximando do dívida bruta. E assim vai a diversas cores. Então, são os países. O que aconteceu agora, em 2019, como é que está esse mapa de calor? Mais endividado o país está. Sendo que o vermelhão, o vermelho mais impressionante o salto que deu em termos do endividamento do mundo ao longo desses últimos 10 anos. O que aconteceu? Vamos comparar os dois. Agora, em 2019, inacreditável como cresceu a dívida bruta no mundo. Em termos do vermelho, que era muito raro, agora passou a ser comparar os dois. Se naturalizou dentro do mapa mundial. Como cresceu a dívida. Então, a conclusão que se chega dessa história só para concluir, e a política fiscal continua ativa, porque nós temos alguns exemplos aqui, listei alguns, Estados Unidos, zona do euro, o que está sendo feito, ainda sendo proposto em termos de política fiscal? Ainda aumentar mais gastos, quer dizer, mesmo a dívida estando alta, os governos estão forçando ainda mais gasto, por quê? Preocupados na economia não reagir, a economia ceder e entrar num processo recessivo. Por conta disso, temos os Estados Unidos anunciando desoneração adicional para empresa e classe média, anúncio para meados de 2020. A zona do euro, pedido explícito do Draghi, presidente do Banco Central Europeu, de uso da política fiscal, pressão especial sobre a Alemanha, porque a Alemanha tem um espaço fiscal ainda, mais expressivo quando comparado com o resto do mundo, sem dúvida. Contínuo aumento de gastos e desonerações na China. O primário está em menos 5,2% do PIB, dados de agosto de 2019. Coreia do Sul, o orçamento de 2020 com aumento de despesa em 9,2%. Quer dizer, as despesas na Coreia do Sul estão aumentando 9,2%. Possibilidade já real de déficit no próximo ano. Coisa que era impensável para um país como a Coreia do Sul. O orçamento de 2020 recentemente. A Índia, o orçamento de 2020 com déficit de menos 3,3% do PIB, consolidação fiscal interrompida já real de dúvidas sobre a viabilidade da sustentabilidade fiscal da Índia. Ou seja, embora a situação fiscal de dívida já esteja num nível elevado, ainda está se usando mecanismos de política fiscal para provocar, impulsionar a economia. Ou seja, aí conclui-se o seguinte, quer dizer, esse quadro, no meu modo de ver, mostra que o espaço para políticas monetárias e fiscal que impulsionem as economias avançadas está, sem dúvida, chegando ao fim. Juro mais negativo do que está difícil. A dívida, qual é o limite da dívida? Todos já têm vários com a dívida bem acima de 100% do PIB. Então, qual é o limite disso? Não sei qual é, mas sem dúvida não é nada muito além do que já é hoje. O que gera uma preocupação, uma incerteza tremenda, porque como é que eu vou investir, eu, empresário, posso investir sem saber, ou com muitas dúvidas, o que vai acontecer com a demanda mais à frente, porque o empresário investe em função de ter quem compre o seu produto, o seu serviço, e nesse contexto em que a expectativa, quer dizer, com todo esse esforço fiscal, o mundo está desacelerando, imagina que se tiver que interromper essa política fiscal ativa e essa política monetária ativa. Então, esse é o primeiro lado do problema. Comércio internacional, uma outra fonte de grande incerteza. Mais um gráfico, agora um gráfico de incerteza, que esse é recente, 2018, que mostra como é que anda a incerteza. Aquele que eu fiz foi do geopolítico e economia, esse daqui é especificamente do comércio internacional. Olha o salto que dá de 96 para cá, olha o salto que dá recentemente o risco do comércio internacional. Mas qual é a origem desse risco? Primeiro, tarifa média de importação. No ZEUA, a tarifa média total de importação americana era menos de 2% em 2017, passou para 4% em 2018, e vai crescer até o final do ano, acima de 5% será, e tem pessoas falando até em 11% de chegar nesse nível de tarifa média americana. Então, um intervalo de 5% a 11%, vamos aguardar, porque o movimento, agora o embate está muito intenso. Além disso, tarifa média de importação, só para citar o caso específico, EUA, China, era menos de 3,1% em 2017, a tarifa de importação americana dos produtos chineses, passou para 12,4% em 2018, em maio de 2019, 18,3%, estima-se mais de 20% em final de 2019. Ou seja, isso é uma coisa inimaginável há anos atrás. O que está acontecendo? O que está gerando essa guerra no comércio? O comércio começou a despencar. Esse aí é o dado, o último dado do primeiro trimestre de 2019. Já está negativo em volume de comércio mundial. Ele chegou a crescer e caiu em 2019. Os dados agora devem estar vindo piores ainda. Agora, tem um índice aqui que mostra um dado bem interessante que fizeram um levantamento, pegaram a stock market, a Bolsa Americana, e levantaram o número de vezes que a Bolsa subiu mais do que 2,5%, e momentos em que a Bolsa caiu ficou mais negativo do que menos 2,5% em um dia, ou seja, variação para mais de 2,5% ou para baixo de 2,5%, e tentaram ver com a matéria do dia seguinte o que levou a Bolsa a ter esse comportamento. De 1900 até fevereiro de 2018, em 1.103 ocasiões em que a Bolsa subiu mais de 2,5% ou caiu abaixo de menos 2,5%, num dia de negociação, a causalidade, a motivação para a queda, 7 vezes foram política comercial, ou seja, 0,6% dos casos. De março de 2008 a agosto de 2019, houve 13 atuações, a Bolsa teve esse comportamento de subir mais de 2,5%, cair menos do que menos 2,5%, 13 vezes. Mas dessas vezes, foram 5 vezes em que as notícias foram relacionadas à questão comercial. Ou seja, a questão comercial está tomando vulto, isso significa que está afetando o PIB. Isso, Bolsa é perspectiva de crescimento, enfim, eu estou tentando aqui traçar com as senhoras e com os senhores um quadro, tentar dar uma sensibilidade, uma percepção do que está se passando, o que essa guerra comercial está levando. E para concluir essa área da parte da guerra comercial, essa é a projeção que o FMI está lançando esses dias, da perda de PIB em função da guerra comercial. O azul claro são as medidas que foram implementadas ao longo de 2018, o amarelo implementadas em maio de 2019, agosto de 2019 é o roxo, e o vermelho é a perda de confiança, é a reação de mercado por conta dessas notícias. O não vermelho são os efeitos diretos e o vermelho é o efeito indireto, o efeito da incerteza, quanto a incerteza gera. Então, pelos dados do FMI, cerca de 700 milhões de PIB serão perdidos ano que vem por conta dessa guerra comercial, o que significa uma perda de 0,8% no PIB mundial. Quer dizer, uma coisa extremamente expressiva só por conta da guerra comercial. Não estou falando em desaceleração de demanda, que eu coloquei de início, nem de Brexit, nem de peste suína, de mais nada, só a guerra comercial. Vamos ao Brexit rapidamente, que o tempo já está terminando. Opa. Não estou conseguindo voltar aqui. Está aqui. O Brexit é um estudo da OCDE. O Brexit vai ter um impacto ao longo dos próximos anos de menos 1,5% aqui no Reino Unido. Em 2020, 2021 chega a 2%, em 2022 a 2,5% de perda de PIB direto. E com incerteza você cresce mais quase meio ponto percentual. A zona do euro perde menos, perde 0,2%, 0,3% de efeito direto em 2020, depois 0,4%, mais de 0,4% com a incerteza. 2021 cresce um pouco, 2022 cresce mais ainda. Isso tudo por conta de perda de importação, perda dos ganhos de comércio, basicamente, e os riscos que os investidores tomam, começam a exigir prêmios de risco maiores nos investimentos, o que causa essa incerteza toda. Os outros, atenção ao Irã, por conta dos drones, e a situação no Oriente Médio volta a se preocupar, o que pode ter efeitos expressivos no preço do petróleo, que é sempre uma commodity extremamente importante quando se fala em crescimento mundial. A Argentina, para falar rapidamente da Argentina, além do impacto dessa eleição do Alberto Fernandes, a provável vitória do Alberto Fernandes com a Cristina Kirchner batendo o Macri, pode representar, certamente representa mais incerteza. Primeiro, pela situação da Argentina estar ruim, o que pode contaminar o resto da América Latina. A gente sabe que um país importante como a Argentina na América Latina, indo mal, pode afetar os investimentos em outros países da América Latina. E, além disso, tem um acordo, foi feito um empréstimo gigante do FMI de 57 bilhões de dólares para a Argentina no governo Macri. E não está claro qual será a posição do Alberto Fernandes ao assumir o governo com relação a o pagamento a negociação com o FMI. Isso terá reflexo no mundo, porque, inclusive, dependendo de como essa negociação será feita, terá efeitos nos próximos empréstimos que o FMI possa vir a fazer para países que necessitem de seu apoio. E a China e Hong Kong também, a questão das manifestações, o que isso vai gerar, o que pode gerar em termos do papel da China nesse novo contexto. Crescimento mundial, esses dados é de julho de 2019, previsões CFMI, previsão que seria para 2019, ou seja, o mundo aparentemente, 2019, o crescimento médio de 80 para cá foi de 3,5%, cairia um pouco em 2019 e subiria para 3,5%. Agora, as economias avançadas não, teriam um recuo, sairia de 2,4% de média para 1,9% esse ano e 1,7%. Eu digo que isso é de julho, porque certamente sairá semana que vem uma nova projeção do FMI. Certamente esses números mudarão. E para baixo. Quão para baixo virão, é difícil dizer. Por quê? Porque de julho para cá houve muita notícia negativa do ponto de vista de aumento de incerteza. Então, até julho o mundo crescia em linha com a média histórica, economias avançadas desacelerariam. Agora, a incerteza elevadíssima trará mais notícias para o cenário de crescimento mundial. Considerações finais. Resumindo, eu vejo, de um lado, um ciclo vicioso, que é o seguinte: incerteza alta leva à retração dos agentes econômicos, por tudo que eu coloquei aqui, o receio do que está por vir, que obriga a ação dos agentes políticos, porque, dado que os agentes econômicos privados recuaram, os agentes políticos têm que ser criativos para fazer com que as coisas retomem, o que leva ao aumento da incerteza, porque as ideias... Ou seja, é um ciclo vicioso. Será que dá para ser rompido? Eu acho que sim, é possível. Por quê? Embora haja muita beligerância em várias frentes, o diálogo ainda está ocorrendo. Talvez a falta de lideranças mundiais, como o professor Roberto Rodrigues bem destacou, nessa hora seja o que nós mais precisaríamos, porque agora o diálogo está acontecendo, mas o acordo tem que sair. O Brexit, por exemplo, o diálogo está acontecendo, mas o tempo urge. Soluções têm que ser dadas ainda esse ano. O embate entre Estados Unidos e China, continua o diálogo ocorrendo. Argentina com a FMI, o diálogo ocorrerá. Todos os diálogos estão acontecendo. Agora, se vai se chegar ou não a um acordo, é difícil de antecipar. Ou seja, o ciclo vicioso ainda pode ser rompido, desde que haja um entendimento entre as partes que já estão dialogando. Bom, era isso que eu tinha para dizer hoje. Desculpa aí por ter passado meu tempo e muito obrigado aí a todos.
Os nossos agradecimentos ao diretor Luiz Guilherme por sua apresentação. Antes de darmos início aos painéis, o presidente Marcelo Fernandes Guimarães passará orientações às senhoras e senhores a respeito da participação através de perguntas aos painelistas.
Sim. Bom, como os senhores e as senhoras podem ver, nós temos uma programação bastante extensa, muito interessante para o dia de hoje. Então, a primeira solicitação é aos palestrantes, que nós seremos rigorosos na questão do controle do tempo. Infelizmente, temos que agir assim para que possamos ter uma eficiência maior no seminário e acabar dentro do horário que está previsto. Para isso, teremos, então, as nossas colaboradoras aí indicando o tempo disponível para cada um dos senhores ou das senhoras. A segunda questão é que as perguntas, nós teremos tempo para algumas perguntas, mas elas deverão ser encaminhadas por escrito também para as nossas colaboradoras, e teremos tempo para algumas poucas perguntas. Então, faremos uma seleção, aquelas que conseguirem expressar o maior número de preocupações, de polêmicas, a gente então vai estar dando encaminhamento. Tá? Falando em polêmica, como os senhores podem notar pela programação, há algumas sessões em que o tempo de moderação é um pouco maior, outras que são um pouco menores, né? Isso é em função do potencial realmente de controvérsia e de polêmica, e que cada um desses temas pode, como foi colocado aqui pelo professor Guilherme Shimura, provocar. Então, em função disso, a gente reservou um tempo um pouco maior para essas moderações, e aí então teremos um pouco mais de flexibilidade para as perguntas. Mas eu conto com a compreensão dos senhores e das senhoras para que, de uma maneira geral, nós não poderemos atender a todas as perguntas. A gente vai procurar sintetizar aquelas que exprimirem o interesse da maioria. Ok? Era isso aí, então. Vamos dar início agora, então, ao item número 3, tá? Com as discussões e os debates que se sucederão. Muito obrigado.
Dadas as orientações, anuncio o item número 3 da programação, um painel com o tema Agricultura da América Latina em um contexto global. Esse painel terão 3 subitens. O primeiro subitem ele é dividido em 2 momentos. Como moderador, convido Tony McDougall, diretor adjunto da Divisão de Grãos e Oleaginosas do Ministério da Agricultura e Alimentação do Canadá. Painelistas, neste primeiro momento, com o subtema Situação dos Mercados Globais, Arnaud Petit, diretor executivo do Conselho Internacional de Grãos e Abdureza Abassian, secretário EMES. Por favor.
Hi there. I'd just like to introduce our first panelist, Mr. Abdelreza Abassian. He is from the AMES Secretariat and Senior Economist at the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. It's the other presentation. Could you tell them? Thank you. No. Okay, while we're getting the presentations right, good morning, everyone. It's my honor to be here. And I cannot start, of course, without first thanking the organizers, FGV, and all the support that we got from all the sister agencies, including OECD, and of course Marcello, my president. Thank you very much for this invitation. As I said, on behalf of the AMES community, I thank everyone for this opportunity. I also thank Arnaud for agreeing that I go first, sort of. I hope there's no hidden plan behind this, but the idea is that Arnaud, Tony, and many people here in the audience are part of the same community called AMES, Agriculture Market Information System. So they thought that perhaps I start by informing those who don't know a little bit more about AMES. Marcello actually has done already a great job, so I won't go too much into detail. But, you know, on my side, I cannot not mention few things that led to the creation of AMES, because it's so relevant to the world we live in today. I came to this country for the first time in December 2008, and it was a conference that was organized by O Global on the sustainability of environmental issues associated with growing utilization of sugarcane for production of biofuels. It was a great conference, but there was a reason that I was here. The reason was that in the US in that year, and a couple of years before that, there was a sudden surge in the use of maize for ethanol production. That was considered, and it was considered for quite a fair amount of, I would say, time, as one of the factors behind the huge price volatility and the price surges that we had. This obviously was of a concern for Brazil, which was using a lot of, or was producing a lot of ethanol, however, from sugarcane. So that was why I was here. And that was also the year when Brazil had decided to cut deforestation in Amazon by 70% within a decade after that. So there were a lot of discussions about the use of the biofuel. But above all, that was a year that I met with a great man, Professor Expedito Parente, the inventor of the green fuel for aviation transport and the father of biodiesel. Unfortunately, he passed away 2 years later. To me, that episode of being here in Brazil in that particular year was a start of something that I had never dreamt would happen, which was the establishment of AMES 2 years later, to which I've been associated since the beginning. There were a lot of reasons for that, really. And let me just go through. I forgot I also have a slides to show you. I'm sorry. Right. So there was very reasons for why what I just mentioned to you is relevant to what I'm going to tell you. It's because the volatility and the price surges started at least a year or two before the establishment of AMES. There were a lot of factors behind it. We had a period of shrinking world reserves, changes in agriculture policies, weather, but more important than perhaps policies and support measures. we had started to really witness erratic production behavior. I guess climate change had already started, but many people didn't take notice. But above all, as I said, it was the link with the rest of the markets, especially energy, and especially from what was happening in the US. And then, of course, there were the trade measures. A little bit like now, countries decided to look after themselves first and the rest of the world next. And the restrictions on exports created more uncertainty in the market. And yes, the unfavorable weather. All of that meant that for the first time, at least in my quite a long career as a grain analyst, we found wheat on the front cover of Financial Times, and that was in August 2010. This was the period, or this was the year, where G20, first with Korea and then under the presidency of Japan, of France, were very much interested in saying, can they have a mechanism to have a better idea, better predictions about what's happening in the global food market? Could there be a system whereby big producers of data, big forecasters could work better together? Could there be a system where the G20 countries could contribute in a way as to provide more stability to global food markets? And this was because of, as you can see, this long chart. This is the FAO Food Price Index. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's known as one of the better barometers of what's happening in the global food market, published every month. I here have a long series for you, which looks at a rather flat situation for many, many years before starting to get very volatile in those years that started by me being here in Brazil. And this situation developed into becoming a sort of a crisis, I would say, when we started seeing the fires in Russia. And that is what that, by the way, that article is about. The wheat prices started to really go up very, very quickly. So G20 decided to set up this let's say, platform, which I just referred to, AMIS, and to really try to focus on some very, very, I would say, precise or important issues. How good the data is, because the understanding was, if we know what the global supply really is, we won't be taking measures, especially trade measures, which may at the end of the day actually harm our own farmers. This was when also that it wasn't just also a question of the accuracy, it was also a question of lots of missing data for many countries, many important countries. Really the information that we needed was not available, so it was very difficult to make predictions. So these were let's say, the main objectives. And it just happened, and I think this is just a matter of a coincidence, that G20 countries present such an important share of some of the most important crops, basically wheat, maize, as they call corn, soybeans and rice. And these were the commodities that AMIS then was asked to concentrate and focus its work on. With the G20 itself, basically, let's say, being in charge of about 70 to 90% of those commodities, which meant if we have good information from these countries, then we should have a good idea about what's happening in the global market. AMIS went further and invited a number of non-G20 countries because of their importance for those crops, and 8 more countries were added to the list. Now, the reason I really here just, basically representing a group of people and experts and organizations, but what I want you to remember is that AMIS is quite unique in its structure, and I frankly do not know of any other setup for any other, let's say, objective than this, because it really brings together in its secretariat 10 international organizations. You have here with me Mr. Arnaud Petit, who is actually the Director General of the International Grains Council, the most renowned center for global analysis of grains and soybean markets and oilseeds markets. But you also have OECD, Jonathan is here. We have WTO and UNCTAD, IFPRI, IFAD, World Bank. So all these organizations join up to be a secretariat. And then you have, of course, the G20 countries. We meet 3 times a year. And 3 times a year, we make sure we have quite a close look at what's happening in the global market. But what really distinguishes us is that when we get together, I am very glad to say, at least until now, there are no flags. Nobody is representing their organization. They're representing a view, an expert view of what they think the market is. And I think this is something to be proud of. Now, what have we done is that we've been trying all these years to get a better information to the people. And we do this through our website. We do this through our monthly information report that Marcello also mentioned, the AMIS Market Monitor. And we also allow, in fact, people to compare our data with other sources. The 3 major sources are published regularly by AMIS. USDA, of course, WASDA, and you have the International Grains Council, and you have what we call FAO AMIS, which combines the AMIS countries plus the rest of the world, which FAO monitors. Now, with this long introduction, but I will be very short on substance from now on, I can show you this. I want to tell you something about the food market and what we're going to discuss perhaps all of today and tomorrow. The food market that we are dealing with today, measured by our barometer, the food price index, is obviously a far cry from the situation we had a few years ago. Prices of all the sub-indices that we use for the FAO food price index are well below what they were at their peaks. And I think this is something that makes a lot of politicians, policymakers, people dealing with agriculture thinking, well, we are okay. The situation is fine. Obviously, it's not because of AMIS. Let's not go that far. However, there is this understanding that the global market is calm, everything is okay. And of course, the situation is far from it. We just heard from Dr. Shumaira. Actually, I was very impressed to see we're using more or less the same slides. This one here is basically replicate of what was presented. And it's true. It says in English on the other side, since 2008, economic policy uncertainty has averaged about twice the level of the previous 23 years. This is very telling. In other words, the food market seems like quiet, but the global market, outside market, is not. And this again takes me back to my last trip to Brazil in 2008. This is the situation we had in 2008. So with this introduction, basically on AMIS and why we shouldn't be fooled by calm markets and why it's always important to still have a thing like AMIS, I can say that at least compared to 2008, I feel a little bit more confident that perhaps should we enter a next level of crisis, we have this time something to look forward to. We have an institution which probably has gained enough trust for people to listen to his advice. The wheat market, I will just say few things about wheat market, and then I pass on to Arnaud, who will give a more general view, and then to experts, my colleagues in AMIS and in FAO, Peter and Shirley, who will tell you quite a bit about soybean and rice market. But as far as wheat is concerned, well, this is probably, I keep saying this, I know those who are into wheat market probably are not very happy with me. It is one of the most boring of the commodities right now because prices are low. Volatility is really not there. The reason, too much supply. This is also, you can see from the prices here. On the left, you have the spot price, the IGC wheat index, which is, basically pretty, I would say, pretty low for compared to the highs that we had, and but it's crawling up a little bit, but nothing serious. And the Chicago prices nearby December also confirming that. The reason why wheat is not such a big issue is that in Northern Hemisphere, most of it has been harvested. Market basically had factored in the little things here and there, so there isn't really much excitement. But there are some excitements, obviously, in the Southern Hemisphere as far as how the planting is going. And there are issues here. Rain is never enough for Argentina, so there are things that people are a bit concerned with. When we're looking at the global picture, we're actually seeing a record crop this year. So that is also another bearish factor on the world wheat market. About 5% increase year on year. in world production, with a lot of major producers actually increasing production year to year. And if you look at Latin America, here you have, of course, Argentina coming back quite as strongly, and that is really mostly thanks to policy developments and farmers' expectation that investing in wheat, at least until now, would mean that better rewards in the future. So we have seen Argentina coming back as a big supplier of wheat, but you also have other players, especially Brazil and Mexico. What it all means at the global level, another good barometer is always a stock to use, and this barometer also tells me on the left-hand side, the bars and the lines, they basically tell you that the supply is good, stocks are also high, in fact second highest on record, but they hide a little thing there. The bigger increase, the biggest increase we have year to year, or actually most of the increase year to year in stocks is in one country, and that is in China. You take China away, and there is a bit of a tightness in wheat. A storm in making? Possible. If you have a bad crop next year, you may have a surprise. So there are the things that, the subtle things that one has to look at very carefully and almost very regularly, because they can happen. In Latin America, your region, basically for what you produce and what you export, you may represent only 9% of the global trade, but actually half the shipment is intra-shipment between the countries in the region, especially with the sudden or the return of Argentina as a much bigger player than it was in the past. How this will continue in the future, we will probably hear from my colleague Holger from FAO, who will talk about the medium term. But basically, for the time being, at least for this year, this is how we see the situation. Right, I'm basically closing now. So with this, as I said, in AMIS Market Monitor, and we brought some copies of this. You can also get them there. It comes out every month. In this report, we cover not just S&D, that is supply and demand, but also a lot of other market drivers, including ethanol market, fertilizer, quite an in-depth review of the prices and so forth. But one of the things we do on the very first page is in 4 bullets, we tell you what the world looked like. Now, don't laugh. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but that's basically what we try to do. And that's what we say about the wheat market. The 4 bullets you see there, which we only published 3 days ago. And also you see here something quite interesting that you never find anywhere else. We compare our data every month with the other sources. So this was actually requested by the IGC, by the G20, because they wanted us to show those differences so that the policymakers know. And thanks to showing these differences over the last 9 years of existence of AMIS, we have been able to converge quite a bit. Converge not because anybody was making a mistake, but because there were a lot of methodological issues that we have managed to make more consistent and coherent. So that's it. Basically, this was my little overview of the market for wheat, and a follow-up a bit on background to AMIS. The situation as we are today, looking at to very early conditions for 2020 is not so bad. In fact, planting area could rise, and we may get even more production next year. You see more of this in these reports, and I think now it's time for me to hand on to Arnaud, who will give you definitely more insightful information on the food sector before the other colleagues join in. Thank you very much.
Para esperar a apresentação do IGC, queria em primeiro lugar agradecer o MAPA de dar a oportunidade ao IGC de contribuir a esse evento. E como uma organização internacional, estamos sempre a produzir dados estamos a publicar dados sobre a situação a nível nacional. E quero dizer que aqui no Brasil há uma situação muito em frente no sentido da transparência do mercado. A CONAB, a produção dos dados da CONAB, mas também ao nível do sector privado, como a Associação ABIOV ou a ANEC, dá muitas informações e ajuda a IGC para fazer o seu trabalho de publicação dos dados ao nível internacional. E agora eu vou mudar em inglês para facilitar depois o diálogo com o Tony e a Bi. So IGC, as I just started to say, is an international organization, commodities body, and indeed we are implementing 2 international treaties, one about the Grain Trade Convention, where we seek for more market transparency and also enhancing the freest trade of grains. And the second part, because when we talk about commodities, we forget just that when we talk about wheat, maize or rice and soybean, we are just mentioning 70% of the energy uptake by the human consumption. So it is also an issue about food security. And we are implementing the Food Assistance Convention, which is a community of donors aligning the policy in terms of food assistance to the needed people. And in terms of information, we monitor 17 commodities, so all cereals, soybean, rapeseed, sunflowers, rice, and at the moment we are on the track to include also pulses as a new market to monitor. Now I would like to really to go on the matter, and I would like to echo what has been said by Abby. At the moment, we see that the price on commodities and agri-commodities are a bit low. If you compare the gray zone, which is a 5 years average, and you have the extreme price we have recorded in the last 5 years. So you see, for example, here in maize, where we are very low in terms of price at the moment. And we apply it for wheat or for soybean, it is more or less the same. So we are entering in a period where the price on commodities are a bit low in reference to the past. The second point I would like to mention also is low prices, but we see also a change in the structure of the main traders or country providing international trade. And for example, you see that South America is really reinforcing its position, its share in terms of export for maize. Today, you see that North America is more or less decreasing by 50% in the last decade, when Argentina, Brazil definitively have increased their market share, but also Ukraine. So there is newcomers also which try to be more present along the year on the commodities market. If we look about maize, which is one of the main crops produced in Brazil, definitively, I would say for the first time, production is going down by 3%. And if you remember the chart about the price, despite this production down, indeed we have still price very low, and competition between operators is there, and also the fact that we have some buffer in terms of stocks from the main exporters helped to manage this low level of production for the coming year. The second aspect also is the feed demand. At the moment, definitively, African swine fever is a main impact, but if we look in our assumption in the next 5 years, the feed demand will continue to grow, but much more slowly than we are expecting. At the moment, for example, our forecast for soybean in terms of feed demand would diminish by 50%. So the path of growth would diminish by 50%. So you see also there new opportunities, but not at the same trends that we have seen until now. And also, I would like to mention, for example, for maize, you see the closing stocks, which are going down in the last 6 years, indeed, and we are now in the very low level in the last 6 years in terms of global stocks. And for the major exporter, we continue to diminish. And here in Latin America, we are used to get a market which has very, very low ending stocks. So meaning climate change could have also an impact quickly on the market. So that's something also to bear in mind in terms of challenges and opportunity for Latin America. And here in stocks, the same like Abby has mentioned for wheat. It is right, if we look about the world stocks, it feels that we have a relatively comfortable level, but the main part is in China for food security purpose. We have to be clear about that. But if you look about the stock use ratio from the main exporters, we are very at the unprecedented level at 13-14%. So that's a level which start to be worrying, I would say, expert about potential extreme volatility in the future if we have some issue about the climate change. About soybean, the same. Indeed, you can see indeed the level of stocks which are going down also. It's usually a market where the ending stock are not very high, but at the moment we see a continued decrease, and I would say that's the main issue for for that, commodities is the development of other policies, like biofuel policies in various countries, in various regions of the world, where we see new targets and may have an impact because oilseed, soybean oil, or soy oil, I would say, could be impacted further, and at the end, the food market. So that's something we have to follow really in the future, is the balance of the new targets in terms of biofuels and decarbonization of the economies, which can have an impact in a short term indeed. Then we have always a question about, can we produce more indeed, and how the farmers could respond to the price market, and as I said, quite low for producers. Here indeed, for South America, we feel there is a real opportunities, and we just make a calculation of the price with the local rate, money, I would say, in comparison to the FOB price, which is always in dollar. And you know that the farmers is not paid in dollar, is paid with his national currency. And you see for Brazil and Argentina, due to the movement in exchange rate, you have seen the extraordinary push, an incentive, I would say, for the farmers to produce more. Definitively, the price in local currency is much more attractive. The question mark for the future, that's indeed for farmers to start also to have, I would say, some speculation on the development of exchange rate, which can also disturb the flow of commodities along the different operators of the grain chain, of the grain value chain. So that's an opportunity for South America, definitively. But it may represent also a challenge to ensure a regular flow of commodities from the producers to the processors. Next point is also that when we talk about, for example, here about soybean, the growing demand is mainly in Asia and definitively in China. So 61% of the gross demand on soybean is in Asia, and China representing 54%. As I said, we feel that the demand in ASEAN region will slow down, but that means there is behind China other markets which are growing in the ASEAN region. Philippines, Indonesia are definitively countries where the demand is starting to grow. We see here Africa, which is today representing only 3% of the increase of gross demand for soybean, and we feel that Africa, with the demographic development in the next 20 years, we are not talking about so far, indeed we are just talking about 20 years, Africa would represent much more than the way today in terms of gross demand. And the question mark, I would say, here is how to connect as a Latin America producers to this market, African market, which is I feel very important for the future. And the last point I would like to mention about this graph is also, if you look about the gross demand in soybean for Latin America, 25%. So we see also an opportunity to produce more in terms of animal proteins there, definitively. And there is also, again, some potential to increase that demand. Now, there is another point when we talk about trade, international trade, is the transportation of your commodity. And here, indeed, we, as IGC, we try to monitor the cost, the ocean freight rate. And you see, indeed, in the past, we had 2017 was definitively a low level of ocean freight rate, and we see development currently where there is a new trend increasing the cost of transportation between, I would say, different continents. And the trend is not equal on all regions. And at the moment, if you look about South America, definitively the trend is going much more quicker, increases much more quicker than the other regions. So that means there is here a challenge for South America, is to be sure that they could continue to stay competitive in terms of export of the product, bearing in mind there is potential increased cost in the future. And here I would like to mention particularly some regulations which the International Maritime Organization is moving forward. The first of all, this is the desulfurization of the fuel, and in that could increase the cost of the fuel for transportation. And also there is a need for investment in the shipment for the owners in order to comply with this regulation. Next year there will be a new standard for the big cargoes in terms of export of dry bulk commodities. And we have to bear in mind that there is still this debate about reducing the CO2 emission from the international shipment sector. So we have a huge level, I would say, of uncertainty, or I would say pressure about the cost of transportation. And you see here in this graph, indeed, the first area is about the chartering, meaning the cost of renting a cargo. And here we just took the example from Brazil to China, so for the Santos port to China Dalian port. And you see indeed that the regular increase about just renting the cargo. And also to give you in mind the value, this shipment, about the 60,000 ton, is about $3.5 million. That represents the cost of this boat to move from Santos to Dalian port. Investing to the scrubber just for the sulfur having low level of sulfur emission, it would represent $6.5 million investment. So you see how this curve unfortunately would continue to increase in terms of cost to rent new cargoes in the future. So that's, I would say, really a point we try to monitor more closely and to have, and we introduce to AMIS, and we will be very happy, I would say, to provide even more and more information about this total cost of trade, because we talk a lot about the FOB price, and it is a logic, I would say, when we talk about exporters and to look the different competitiveness of the producers. But when we talk about price at destination, we may have a different story. So that's a project we are running, and we hope that in next year we will be really in position to have more information and more duration in terms of information in order to provide some insight about the cost of trade in grains. And I feel with that I end up my presentation in order to provide more time for discussion with participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arnaud and Abby, for some excellent presentations and an excellent overview. As a moderator, I'm going to take the moderator's hat and take the first question, and it's for Mr. Abassian. And I guess I'd ask, why did AMIS meet in Brazil, and what were the main outcomes of that meeting?
Thank you, Tony. Yes, we are here for a very important reason. We have a meeting, 2 meetings a year called Information Group. Marcello is our president, and we've been benefiting from his inputs and all the efforts he has made into making this meeting a success, and that's why we are here. In fact, the entire group, I think a good crowd of AMIS colleagues are present in this room. The purpose of this meeting is really to review the outlook, for the short-term outlook for the food market, and to try to see what policy measures, what important factors, driving factors are shaping this market. And as I said, it's not a meeting of just countries and organizations. It's a meeting of experts, all but me. And the idea is that we come to some general understanding of what is happening in order to be able to report this to policymakers should we think that there is an issue that needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby. I did have one follow-up question very quickly. I know you've been with the Secretariat since the beginning, and the spirit and intent, as you said, was to improve information globally. Have you seen, I mean, what kind of results have you seen over the 9 years that it's been around?
Right. That's a bit, okay. In a way, it's very easy. We've seen a lot of results, a lot of good results, but to actually associate it with one or two country or international organizations is a bit difficult. From the organization side, I think the harmonization of data among major providers of data, our colleagues at WASDA and USDA, our colleagues at the Council, FAO, I think has been a great achievement. However, personally, I think the biggest credit goes to the countries for what they provide to AMIS on far more regular basis than we were ever used to, and this is the information that we also share with the Council and other stakeholders. And in this regard, a number of countries have made really huge step forward. Of course, Brazil is definitely one of the best in the class. But as we are here, I don't want to really, all countries have all one in their own way been contributing. But I must say I'm tremendously grateful to China. And the reason for it is that China is not and cannot be just compared with any small country or any country. Its size, its importance, and the complexity that comes with China is definitely something quite important. We have from China, in fact, 2 delegates, our focal points from the country. We had very interesting debate yesterday. As you all know, there is a very tragic development happening in China with regard to ASF. This has implications far beyond China. So obviously, if we know more about what's happening inside China, that gives us also some let's say, ammunition to understand what's happening globally. And for that, I must say, I'm very grateful for the inputs and information that we get directly from China on this very, very important issue.
Thank you, Abby. I'll open it up to the floor. I'm not sure, are you guys taking questions? Writing down questions, or are there any questions that the audience would like to ask our 2 speakers? Okay, while you're thinking of these questions, I'll ask one more question myself to the 2 panelists. What do you see the biggest risk in the short term and the medium term to the grains and oilseed sector globally?
In terms of short term, I would say definitively the fact that now we have regions where climate change can impact production and also consumers in other regions is an issue that we have really to monitor, because we have not anymore the level of stocks we had in the past. So that's the first point. And the second point I would say, of issue linked to that is the tremendous development of the companies to handle the sustainability approach. And if you look about soybean, but also on other commodities, you can see there is a real development of farming practices, but also along the value chain, to be able to respond to consumers' attitudes. So that's, I would say, very important, because it's reorganizing all the value chain. And that, I feel, it's the second factor that we have really to look further now in the medium term, is how we can have all this information moving, so meaning new technologies and big data, for having this information moving really along the value chain and ensuring that all operators can get a fair return, I would say, of this investment.
Thank you. Yes, okay, good. Sorry, right, I don't want to be too controversial, but that's my nature, to be a bit controversial. So I think that in a short term, the most important issue may be on trade, and how bilateralism is taking over multilateralism, and this is the danger. It's a danger. We have a proven record of how it can go wrong and how it can be inefficient. So and this will affect a lot of countries, a lot of farm decisions, and it will affect prices in a most untransparent way. The second one, and that is the one that is closer to my heart, when you deal with short-term issues, is noise, market noise. And I think that we are living in a world where market noise is tremendous. Sentiments are set with these noises, and they're not always accurate. So we may actually end up making decisions based on wrong information. So I think that these are the 2 things that would really be something to reflect on in a short term.
Thank you, Abby and Arnaud, and I guess these are good selling points for Amos and the IGC, because with good information we make good decisions, transparent decisions. Thank you very much. I guess we're going to have to wrap up this session right now, and we'll continue after the coffee. Thank you.
Os nossos agradecimentos ao participante desta primeira parte do painel. Senhores e senhoras, são 11 horas e 16 minutos. Faremos um intervalo para um coffee break de 10 minutos. Consta do programa 30, mas nós tivemos que nos alimentar dos 20 minutos para poder dar prosseguimento ao andamento da programação. Em 10 minutos retornaremos à segunda parte do painel Situação dos Mercados Globais, Agricultura da América Latina em um Contexto Global.
deixar então só uma água, porque o não tá pegando. Não, porque eu tinha botado uma água pro palestrante. Acho que eu tô falando não. Eu tinha botado uma água pro palestrante e a outra pro cara da cerimonialista, mestre de cerimônias. Mas ele tá bebendo aqui, ele tá botando água dele aqui.
Senhoras e senhores, por favor, queiram ocupar os seus lugares para darmos continuidade ao Seminário Internacional, Desafios e Oportunidades para a Agricultura na América Latina. Teremos agora a segunda parte do tema Situação dos Mercados Globais, Agricultura da América Latina em um Contexto Global. Continua como moderador, Tony McDougall. Como painelistas, eu convido Peter Thomas, economista da FAO, e Shirley Mustafa, economista da FAO. Lembrando que cada painelista terá, conforme o programa, 15 minutos para a sua apresentação.
Welcome back, everyone. We'll do a panel session now on soybeans and rice, so let's get right to it. I'd like to introduce Peter Thomas, oilseed analyst for the FAO.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to provide you with more detailed information now related to the role of Latin America in the global soybean market. We thought it could be of interest to this forum if we presented the latest AMIS assessment of the global soybean market, including due reference to Latin America's leading producers. And we decided to zoom in a bit on the soybean market because, in fact, many of the challenges and opportunities which have been already mentioned this morning apply directly to the soybean sector. Before I present our latest market assessment, let me first have a quick look backwards. Looking in the left graph at the development of global soybean production in the last 20 years, we can see that in the early 2000s, Latin America surpassed the US as the world's main soybean basket. And today the region occupies a key position in global production, accounting for about half of total output. The diagram in the center reveals that Latin America's steep production rise has been achieved primarily through an expansion in area planted. Furthermore, we need to keep in mind that Latin America's production is primarily export-oriented, as over time the region emerged as a competitive global supplier without, as mentioned this morning, major financial support from the concerned governments. As you can see in the diagram on the right side, Latin America's share in the global export market has reached an impressive 60 to 70% for soybeans, soy oil, and soy meal. Especially noteworthy is a steep rise in shipments from Brazil, which since 2012-13 is the world's top supplier ahead of the United States. Now, while the soybean sector's fast growth has offered many opportunities, it also brought with it a number of challenges. In particular, we can see four critical aspects. First, at the agronomic level, the steady expansion of soy production has led to crop rotation issues and increasing exposure to pest and weed risks. As a result, farmers depend on constant technological innovation, which includes strong reliance on GM varieties. Second, on the environmental side, the sector's rapid expansion has entailed wide-ranging land use changes, notably large-scale conversion of pasture land, degraded areas, as well as forested land. And more recently, such developments have given rise to sustainability concerns. Third, on economic grounds, the region's strong reliance on export markets brought along some risks, especially when shipments are destined to a limited number of countries. In fact, Latin America's exports have become increasingly exposed to things like exchange rate fluctuations and changes in both domestic and trade partners' policies. Finally, logistic aspects have become very important in that domestic transportation infrastructure needs to keep pace with the sector's expansion if exporters are to remain competitive. After these introductory comments, Let me now walk you through the global market situation and outlook for soybeans, starting with prices. The chart on the left shows IGC's soybean spot price index, which combines key quotations from North and South America. As you can see, soybean prices have been on downward slope since about May 2008. Essentially, prices responded to two main factors: the Sino-US trade tensions and the outbreak of African swine fever in China. In May of this year, the index appreciated somewhat, triggered by extraordinary planting delays in the US. However, from June onward, prices again moved sideways, thus remaining subdued in historical terms. The spike in prices observed in the last few weeks stems from unexpected sizable orders of US origin soybeans by Chinese companies, following temporary tariff exemptions granted by the Chinese government. I shall skip the discussion of the individual countries' export prices, which I'm showing on the other graphs, and of the futures markets, and go directly to Amos's supply and demand estimates for 1819 and forecasts for 1920. In a nutshell, on the left side, you can see that after the excess of global production overutilization recorded in 1819, for 1920, Amos is forecasting a shortfall in production overutilization. Accordingly, the last season's market build-up in global stocks, a significant year-on-year drawdown in inventories is forecast for 1920. But let's have a closer look at the world's major soybean-producing countries, starting with the Northern Hemisphere, where harvests are now underway. For the US, the latest official figures point to a 20% reduction in output, stemming from a market drop in plantings due to unfavorable weather conditions, as well as uncertain market prospects. Moving to the Southern Hemisphere, where soybean plantings are about to commence, Brazil is reporting a slow start in sowing activities due to drier than usual conditions. We haven't seen much of that in the last 2 days in Rio, but elsewhere in the country, yes. Also in Argentina, weather conditions will need to be monitored closely, although planting decisions there will likely also be influenced strongly by the country's overall economic outlook, as well as possible changes in trade policies. Of course, at this point, our forecast for Southern Hemisphere crops are still very tentative, as planting progress and yield performance will depend on weather, the level of input application, the farmer's response to policy changes, and other factors. Moving to utilization, which in the case of soybeans essentially refers to crush. The left chart shows that in 1819, global utilization is estimated to have grown by just 1%. The slowdown mostly stems from an exceptional contraction in China's crushings, linked directly to the outbreak of African swine fever. And for 1920, Amos is currently forecasting global utilization to grow by a below average rate of 2%. As to individual countries, Brazil is expected to lead the global expansion in soybean crush, underpinned by both higher meal demand from the country's export-oriented livestock sector and increased soy oil uptake by the domestic biodiesel industry. China, by far the world's largest crusher, could see a marginal recovery in crushings based on both robust meal demand from the country's poultry and agriculture industry and first efforts to rebuild the domestic pig herd. However, growth will remain way behind the customary levels seen in China. As to the US, the second largest soybean crusher, the anticipated small year-on-year drop rests on the assumption that domestic crush margins will fall below last season's attractive levels. And now a quick look at inventories on the right, which in Amos, I should specify, refer to the sum of individual countries' end-of-season stocks. The graph here shows our estimated all-time high carry-out inventories in 1819. Last season's surge was driven by an unprecedented accumulation of stocks in the US, where a record large crop coincided with a decline in export opportunities due to lower orders from China. And these record high ending stocks explain the current subdued level in international prices. For the new season, we currently forecast global inventories to revert to levels recorded prior to the recent surges, while marking a sharp year-on-year decline, which would be concentrated in the US. The current forecasts do not point to a particular market tightness, considering that combined reserves of major exporters would still be a fourth highest on record, with stock-to-use ratios also remaining within a comfortable range. Of course, this situation could change in case of unexpected supply shocks in Latin America. Moving on to global trade. The diagram on the left shows that for 1819, our latest estimates confirm an unusual contraction in global transactions. The year-on-year drop has been largely caused by China, whose purchases plunged by some 11 million tons, compared to customary growth rates of around 5 to 10%, as a result of both the Sino-US trade tensions and African swine fever decimated feed demand. In 1920, global trade is currently forecast to stagnate, basically matching last season's level. For China, the world's top soybean importer, we currently project a slight rebound from last season's subdued level, based on the aforementioned growth in feed demand. However, at this stage, it is difficult to gauge by how much demand may grow, also because it remains to be seen to what extent incremental feed demand will be met by soy meal, given that China, in response to the enduring trade tensions, has started to diversify its feed base. As for exporters, the chart in the middle shows the shipments in the world's top 3 exporters, which over the last 2 seasons have seen some important shifts. First, in 1718, Brazil expanded its exports, basically compensating for that year's crop shortfall in Argentina. Then in 1819, US shipments contracted markedly to the benefit of Brazil's exporters as a result of the protracted Sino-US trade tensions. As to 1920, a meaningful recovery in US exports doesn't seem likely, given subdued global demand prospects, and because so far the likelihood of a quick and lasting resolution in the US-China trade conflict remains unclear. Accordingly, sales from Brazil are forecast to remain above historic levels. And this brings me to my wrap-up. So as far as the overall market situation and outlook is concerned, based on AMIS's current forecasts, the 1920 global supply and demand outlook for the soybean market looks somewhat more balanced when compared to the burdensome situation that characterized the past season. As for international prices, we can see the following nearby drivers. First, final harvest and stock estimates for Northern Hemisphere countries, notably for the US, which could still bring surprises. In fact, USDA's WASDE report, which is due for release later today, is expected to include important revisions for the US soy production and inventories, not only in 1920, but also, rather unusually, for the 1819 season. Second, South American weather and planting progress will need to be monitored closely. As for African swine fever, despite ongoing containment efforts, the African swine fever threat is unlikely to cease anytime soon. According to experts, it will take at least 6 to 12 months before first signs of herd recovery may be seen in Asia. Meanwhile, global feed demand will continue to be depressed. And lastly, but certainly not least, the course of the Sino-US trade negotiations will continue to weigh strongly and directly on prices in the soybean complex and beyond. As for other factors and emerging issues, I would like to highlight the following ones. First, trade policy initiatives seem to have come into greater prominence, and this has been mentioned earlier by other speakers this morning. And this includes not only bilateral sector-specific trade initiatives and comprehensive trade agreements, but also unilateral border measures and fully fledged trade disputes, which are characterized by widespread and possibly long-term repercussions for soybean and other commodity markets. Secondly, and in part related to my previous point, recourse to agricultural support measures could become more important in a number of countries. Third, public scrutiny of production sustainability aspects and calls by consumers, especially in the EU, for responsible sourcing have started to steer action by policymakers as well as private sector stakeholders. And we have seen some encouraging initiatives under consideration, especially in Brazil, in this regard. Also, logistic challenges, especially regarding inland transportation systems, as I mentioned in the beginning, are expected to remain of particular importance in Brazil, Argentina, and the US. Finally, on the agronomic side, farmers are likely to be faced with new pesticide restrictions, posing important challenges in the control of pests and weeds. And furthermore, it appears that the effects of climate change, including more frequent extreme weather events, are increasingly felt in crop production, posing new agronomic challenges. So no doubt these points I just listed are all issues that will tend to increase uncertainty in the level, have increases in uncertainty levels in the soybean market and also in other agricultural commodity markets. And this completes my overview. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was an excellent presentation. Now I'll introduce Shirley Mustafa from the Trades and Markets Division, Rice Analyst for the FAO. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm actually very pleased to be here today and present to you our latest outlook of the global rice supply and demand situation in the 2019-20 season. While doing so, I hope to shed some light into regional trends, also in an effort to keep my intervention relevant to the Latin American context, but because time is tight, some sacrifices will have to be made, but please feel free to engage with me after in whatever dialogue session for any queries that you may have. So let me begin with production, and by recalling some recent trends, particularly over the last decade. With the exception of a few years in which we had weather setbacks, most of them associated with El Niño or La Niña conditions, global rice production has expanded more or less steadily over the past decade. This expansionary trend peaked last year when world rice output hit an all-time high of around 518 million tons on a milled rice basis. Now, we anticipate that global production over the ongoing season will actually interrupt this expansionary trend and decline somewhat to around 513.5 million tons. Now, this expected contraction would mirror or would stem from area reductions in all major geographical regions except for Europe. However, as you may see from the chart on the left, on the whole, we do not anticipate rice output to fall to low levels, but rather to remain at its second highest on record, and this is to a large extent a reflection of one, expectations of rice output in Asia, and to a lesser extent also Africa remaining at above average levels. In fact, we see the overall contraction in global production in 2019 concentrated in just a handful of countries, namely Brazil, the United States, China, and India. Now, don't be deceived by the chart in the middle in terms of while it does portray the overall regional trends, it does not portray the scale of output across the regions. In fact, and this is simply because we wanted to shed some light and have a common scale for all regions. But as you may be well aware, Asia is the world's rice hub, particularly when it comes to production and consumption. As such, if you don't mind, I will delve a little bit into some trends that underlie our outlook for this particular region. Now, within Asia, we expect Asia's top producers, and actually the world's top producers, China and India respectively, to each face production contractions this season. However, reductions in each of these countries are likely to come under diverging policy environments. Now, in the case of China, perhaps it would be a little bit useful to provide some context. In the lead up to 2017, China had seen for nearly a decade near uninterrupted production expansions, part of which were motivated by successive increases in government purchase prices. Now, this particular policy move was successful in shoring up producer prices and domestic prices as a whole, but at the same time, this move or this policy eroded China's competitive edge in the international market, also leading to very sizable imports. Now, the ensuing supply overhang encouraged Chinese officials in 2017 to embark in a set of what are called supply-side reforms, akin to those that targeted the maize and the cotton sector, but with very significant differences. Foremost amongst these have been the maintenance of government purchase prices for rice and wheat, and this is common with wheat as well, and also, however, some adjustments to the procurement system. Now, although government purchase prices were were maintained. These have been reduced successively, starting in 2017 and maintained at comparatively lower levels over the ongoing season. There have also been other schemes seeking to take least productive lands out of rice cultivation and into other crops, either through crop rotation or through outright fallowing. And we anticipate, again, this is just to provide you some context, that China's overall production reduction this season comes within this framework of this overarching supply side reforms. Now, on the other hand, we have a slightly different trend in India, which has maintained a rather steadfast policy in favor of rice producers, many of which, as you may know, are very much smallholders and rather dependent on the performance of the monsoon rains for their overall production practices. Now, India's policy in favor of rice producers has been most notably implemented through minimum support prices, which have as well been increased successively. And in fact, we've seen somewhat of an intensification of these increases in last season, where in an effort by the Indian government to attain its aim of doubling farmer incomes by 2020, they decided to set minimum support prices at 1.5 times the cost of production each season. Now, this has tended to render rice an even more attractive crop because, again, these minimum support prices are implemented through rather sizable domestic acquisitions from the domestic market. Now, in India and many other countries, and to a lesser extent also Asia, growing conditions this season haven't been especially favorable, and this was particularly so during the first half of the monsoon rains, June and July, when we saw very consistent and at times very steep rainfall deficiencies. However, recomposition of the rains towards August allowed, in the context of, again, rice being a very attractive production choice still in India, plantings to regain pace. So on the whole, we anticipate India, because of these offsetting factors, if you put it that way, to still gather a very sizable crop. Now, let me turn to the Latin American context a little bit in here, like Peter did. I'd like to have a very brief look backward. Now, the Latin American rice sector has been and continues to be in the midst of a long-term adjustment trend that actually began before 2000, the year at which our chart begins on the left side there. It actually began more or less in the late 80s. Essentially, we've seen a trend, a rather consistent trend of rice area shrinking and being diverged to other purposes. Now, Brazil, being the largest producer and consumer of rice in Latin America, as you can imagine, has had quite an important role in this adjustment process, although it has not been the only country to witness steady cuts in rice area. This has been so particularly over the past 2 seasons, in which we've seen important producers such as Argentina, Uruguay, Colombia, and Peru impacted by lower paddy prices that have tended to squeeze producer margins. This, of course, in tandem with some increases to production costs that have, again, really diminished the profitability of rice cultivation in recent seasons and accelerated that pace of area declines. Now, traditionally and over the longer terms, as you can see, productivity levels in Latin America and the Caribbean have risen steadily, and this is a reflection of, again, the introduction of higher yielding varieties and improved producer practices, but also a greater concentration of rice cultivation in high yielding and very crucially irrigated land. Now, over the course of the 2019 season, we actually saw some weather setbacks in Latin America, particularly in Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and to a lesser extent in Paraguay, that actually dampened the performance of average productivity levels. This, of course, compounded on the area contraction. So we anticipate, or rather we estimate, because the bulk of these crops have already been harvested in the region, to translate into a more or less 7% production reduction in the whole region. Now, turning to international trade very quickly, before I begin my roundup of recent trends and our expectations for the following year, particularly 2020, I would like to really spend a brief moment to actually shed some light into some dominant features of the international rice market. Don't worry, I will not bore you with an overly long explanation or technical explanation or description of the rice market, but I think recalling some features might be useful in terms of contextualizing some of the rest of my intervention. Well, the foremost amongst the features of the rice market is market thinness. Even though international trade in rice has grown and by non-negligible margins in recent years, on the whole, it's still a very small proportion of what is globally produced is actually traded, and this proportion is still under 10%. Export concentration also remains significant in the rice market. So we have the top 5 rice exporters actually still accounting for around 80% of overall volumes traded. Now, one other very important feature is that the majority of rice that is traded across the globe is milled rice and belongs to the indica families. However, we have seen also fragrant rices, and here I mean the basmati and the jasmine varieties, register considerable growth over recent years. Now, the reason I bring back all these varietal differentiations is because, again, this is one feature that also sets up aside the rice sector from other commodities, which is market segmentation, in that there is little to no substitution oftentimes between the various varietal families and an extremely high level of quality differentiation. This is all due to very strong consumer preferences. Now, for the purposes of the globe and for Latin America as a whole, what would be of most interest in terms of recent price developments would be those pertaining in the indica market. Again, the largest share of the overall rice market, which, as you can see, on the whole has remained, in terms of price developments, have been rather static since the start of the year and at a comparatively weak or accessible levels. And this has been primarily the reflection of the conspicuous and very conspicuous absence of very important importers from the international market. By important ones, I mean particularly Bangladesh, Indonesia, and to a very large extent also China, which as part of its, again, the overall supply side reforms, has also witnessed a reduction in overall volumes imported in recent years and a concomitant increase in supplies exported abroad, particularly to African countries. Now, we expect these trends to essentially translate into a contraction of volumes traded in the ongoing season and a meek recovery over the course of 2020. So overall trade would be around 47.5 million tons. Now, again, I've explained a little bit more about the dynamics behind developments in China. So we see essentially China next year taking essentially a trade neutral position. So zeroing in on that trade imbalance that the country has had for multiple years now. Now, on the whole, the trade recovery would be actually sustained by African countries, a strong demand from African countries. However, we do see imports by other regions also regrowing, and Latin America, this would be the case also for Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, at a country level, we expected this resurgence in Latin American trade to be driven by stronger demand from Brazil and from Venezuela. Now, Venezuela, mostly, of course, the import expectations are linked to the production contractions and quite steep ones that the country has seen in recent years because of very large structural problems, including lack of availability and access to basic inputs. Now, on the export side, again, much of the expansion that we foresee for 2020 would be absorbed by important exporters, in particular India, but we also, like I mentioned before, see China making considerable headway in advancing its export position. Now, amongst Latin American exporters, we see some increases pertaining Argentina and Uruguay. This is mostly because of ample availability still on reserves, while we see some contractions actually pertaining in Brazil. And this is to a large extent owing to negative expectations about the performance of rice production over the 2020 year. But keep in mind that the 2020 crop in Brazil is literally just being planted. So these are rather preliminary expectations at this stage. Let me turn to rice use before I wrap up more or less my intervention. Although the slide may look a little bit busy with a lot of content, there are two very simple takeaways from this slide. One is that rice is food, with the bulk of all overall supplies actually destined to food at the global level. This is by a margin of around 80%, and this is even more so in Latin America and the Caribbean, where essentially the majority of rice is destined to food intake. Now, of course, regional trends or trends vary across the region. I think this is rather natural, with Asia, per capita uptake in Asia averaging around 78 to 8 kilos per person, but there are also wide intra-regional variations of rice consumption, and this is the case even in Latin America and the Caribbean, where you see, for instance, countries such as Argentina, Uruguay, the rice sector essentially been very export-oriented and not necessarily serving its own consumption base. And on the other hand, you have countries such as Cuba, Peru, and Panama, where overall consumption exceeds the 60 kilo per mark and is very important in terms of the overall food intake of the country as a whole. Now, in terms of drivers, very quickly, these are fairly simple. We expect utilization to continue expanded because of food use. Now, in Asia, which again absorbs the majority of rice, expansions are primarily linked to population growth, whereas there are some positive expansions in regions such as Africa, most notably, and this is because of long-term dietary shifts favoring rice consumption in the region, most notably in West Africa. Now, to wrap it up, on the closing stock side, we see India and China, the two leading players on the globe, very much influencing overall dynamics at the global level on the inventory side. So we see a reduction in overall inventories in China being partly mitigated by another increase in inventories in India. From a regional perspective, and as you can see from the chart as a whole, however, we anticipate overall inventories to remain still rather ample for rice, in fact, at the second highest of level on record. This, of course, does not preclude the fact that at the regional level, we may see some more market tightness being evident, as is the case, for instance, of Oceania and also Latin America and the Caribbean. So I'll close my intervention there, and again, I welcome any questions that you may eventually have.
Thank you, Shirley and Peter. We're going to move on now from the short term to the medium term outlook. So Jonathan will join us up here. So I guess I'll start by introducing our first speaker. Our first speaker will be Holger Matti, and he is the team leader of the medium-term outlook at the FAO in the Markets and Trades Division. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tony. Morning, everyone. So it is my pleasure to provide the global baseline as a context and lead in to our discussion of the medium-term prospects and challenges in Latin America, which Jonathan will present right after. So we build on the work of our AMIS colleagues and a whole host of other member collaborators by using their databases and their market expertise to develop a medium-term baseline. This baseline offers policymakers and other stakeholders medium-term assessment of national, regional, and global market prospects for agriculture commodities, biofuel, and fish. The baseline projections are not a forecast, and that's a very important point, but they form what we hope the stakeholders consider a plausible scenario based on specific assumptions. And here I have listed a couple of these assumptions. So in our case, medium term means a 10-year horizon. Our model and our outlook is global in coverage, but we don't offer specific numbers for each and every country in the world. We have in the current configuration, about 40 countries, and the other countries are aggregated in regional aggregates. The outlook, as you see it here, focuses on major temperate climate commodities: cereals, oilseeds, livestock products. We do have cotton and a few other things. Biofuel, fish in a separate model. But the big point I'm trying to make, and then for the Brazilian context, is that we don't have fruits and vegetables. Here, FAO does have a specific unit that's that also provides this for tropical fruits, bananas and citrus, but it is not contained in here. It says here that the projections are model-based, so there is an underlying model, but the outlook, the baseline numbers, they present a consensus projection among the group of experts. But because we have a model underlying, this gives us the opportunity to do scenario analysis on emerging issues like the African swine fever epidemic right now. Now I'd like to begin the more technical part by quickly introducing our key macro assumptions. And these assumptions, as you see here, are as we got them in October 2018. So they're about a year old, and as we heard from the colleague from the econ department, and as we all know, since then, prospects have darkened. But you have to keep in mind, our baseline is based on these projections as we got them back then. So just to run down the major points here, so the global population growth is estimated at about 1% a year for the next decade. Regional differences, so about 770 million people will be added over the next 10 years, about 350 of them in Asia and in Africa, respectively, which means Africa still has about a 2.5% growth rate in population. The economic recovery here, as I said, about a year ago, was still seen quite positively with about a 1 to 2% per capita growth in the industrialized countries, about 4% in China, 7.5% in India, 2.5% in Brazil. But so we take national averages, but we also have to keep in mind that the income distribution in country varies. Like in Africa, the poor people lag behind, and that's, for instance, reflected also in our meat projections, which, if you look at them, you may think they don't really correspond to the average, but they correspond to our assessment of the income distribution. Crude oil price is our proxy for energy cost. We take the real price flat, so which gets us to about $70. And then we also, for the trade model, look at currency shifts, real depreciations we see in Brazil, China, the EU, real appreciations we see in countries like Russia, Mexico, or Paraguay. And that has, impact on how we see the trade. Now, here, just let me start out with some key messages on the 4 major activities that we cover, and then I will go into elaborating a little bit on our assessment of the drivers to give you a little bit more insight how we arrived at these key messages. So the first one on prices is that most commodity prices in real terms will continue to decline, follow their long-term trend, which means that we think that productivity will stay ahead of the demand growth. But of course, prices in actuality are still subject to volatility, and also these are global reference prices denominated in dollars, and depending on the exchange rate, of course, domestic prices may have a different trajectory. On the consumption side, as I said, the bulk of the additional population will be in Africa and Asia, therefore the strong demand growth will come from these regions. On the per capita consumption, we think that the dairy, sugar, and fats are the ones that show the strongest growth. And because of the evolution of human diets towards a higher inclusion of animal products, we need more feed. So that is another driver, while on the other hand, biofuel on a global context is not seen as a major driver, contrary to previous decade. Production here globally equals consumption, so which means the market itself, agriculture market, over the commodities that we cover, will grow about 15% over the decade. We think that productivity increases will be responsible for the bulk of this growth, and the global agricultural land use remains largely unchanged. So, because production and consumption will be increasingly separated regionally, trade is important for food security by importers as well as livelihoods by exporters. The dominant regions that grow in terms of growth will be the Black Sea region and South America, and China being still big but rather stagnant. Now here, I expanded the food price index that my colleague Abby showed you before for the next 10 years, just to illustrate what we mean by slightly declining. So the real price is the red line that you see here, the nominal one is the blue one. So we're saying that supply and demand fundamentals keep the international reference prices slightly declining. So we mean that additional resources can be mobilized at slightly lower prices, no bottlenecks are foreseen. And most commodity prices will stay in line. We don't see any real outliers. Now, let me elaborate a little bit why and how we come to this consumption picture. So, population, most significant driver. That's the easy one. The more complex one is what is behind per capita food demand, because there are multiple drivers. There's, of course, income linked especially to meat and dairy consumption. But then apart from income, your lifestyle is also important. If you move away from the farm in urban context, you consume more processed foods, which tend to be rich in sugar and fats. And then, of course, there's a cultural context and a policy context which shifts eating pattern positively, negatively, influencing consumption. And there we look at how this influences especially the meat, fats, and sugar consumption. I already mentioned feed. What I want to make the point here is that we think globally we are still on an intensification path, which means more feed per output of meat over the next decade. And the drivers for the biofuel is really policies to reduce pollution and to promote the farmers, the producers of the feedstocks. And we see that here in Brazil, we see that in China, and also in Indonesia to be a factor, but on a scale globally that is relatively small. On the production side, what we want to alert you here is our thinking regarding the decomposition of the extensive versus the intensive margin. The green one is productivity. Productivity here means yield increases as well as crop intensity increases, which we already heard is a big factor here, double and triple cropping. So you see on the top, the green one is the productivity share of the growth over the next decade. The blue one is the extensive margin, the area increases, and it's clearly dominated there, but it varies a little bit commodity by commodity. So because of the strong need for feed, soybean will still draw the most area in, while in rice, for instance, some area will go out. And in others, we have shifts. The net is almost zero, like for wheat, but area will come in Russia and it will go out in the US. Our assessment on the livestock side is more that we need more expansion of herds because the scope for productivity increases is not quite there that much. So especially poultry and sheep meat, we will need herd expansion, while beef and pig, we see more scope for productivity increases. The last one here is the trade. So we plotted here the net trade aggregated over the commodities that we cover for a number of countries and regions that are of interest here. And there are no big surprises. So the top line is Latin America, and we've heard that in the introductory remarks. We echo that Latin America will be the supplier of the world, while North America, the second one from the top, is leveling off on the account of lower soybean shipments and others slowing. Then the gray one is basically Russia emerging more and more. Then the green one there, just above the zero line, is India, so making the point that India, huge economy, but will maintain its self-sufficiency focus. And then on the importers, we have China, the blue one, leveling off, as we already said, and Africa in need of more and more imports. And as my last slide, I'd like to discuss a little bit the risks and uncertainties. As I said, this is not a forecast, this is a projection that makes assumptions that we consider plausible with the information we have at the time, knowing that they will not materialize as such, because some of them are very simple, because average weather, constant policies, and so on. And then we like to give people some indication of where deviations are likely and which direction they might go. So where we have the opportunity to do this in a quantitative way, we do sensitivity analysis. So in the current outlook, we feature some analysis our colleagues at the EU did, and we ourselves do stochastic analysis where we offer ranges of outcomes. Then, of course, we have certain assumptions about preferences, what people think about health developments and the consumption of red meat and versus chicken, and these things, they may change, right? How vegetarianism rises, or maybe we don't know. We just make assumptions, but those are uncertainties, policies, where governments try to steer nutrition in a certain way. They may change, like sugar taxes, things like that. Of course, then on the supply side, diseases like the African swine fever, which we make an assumption last year, and it turns out we were too optimistic. It got much worse than we thought last year, and we just did a scenario to evaluate the situation now. Trade, we've already heard about that. Trade disputes have an impact. We make a certain assumption about that. But times go on and we learn, and so next year we'll have a different evaluation of that. And agreements, for instance, we have a number of them. We have the EU with Japan, but the Mercosur EU we don't have in this outlook, but the first assessments are now coming in, and they see more exports of beef from Brazil to the EU. So if it's ratified before we do the next outlook, we'll put it in. And then, of course, data. Data is always a sticky point, and we've heard already from our colleagues that there's always uncertainty because how data is reported by countries may change and has different levels of certainty. So that concludes my presentation. I'd like to thank you for your attention. And I'd like to direct you also to our website. So if you want to see more about the data, they can be downloaded from the database. All the narrative, the chapters on each commodity are available. They're downloadable there. And if you have any specific question, I'm very happy to hear from you on our email addresses, and we're looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now to put things in perspective in Latin America, I'll welcome Jonathan Brooks, head of the Agricultural Markets and Trade Division at the OECD. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and good morning again. What I'd like to do is to say a few words that try and put the situation for Latin America in that global context. We've got here a copy of the Spanish version. There's a Spanish version of the Outlook which is released, and my colleague Hubertus Guy actually was in Mexico to release that just 2 weeks ago. We have versions of the report that are prepared in English, French, Chinese, Spanish, and Italian as well at the moment. So what I'd like to do is to say something about how food and agricultural policies across the world, but not least in Latin America, are expected to respond to what we call a triple challenge. So feeding a world population that's expected to approach 10 billion by 2050 and providing adequate nutrition. Doing so sustainably, using essentially the same amount of land and less water globally, while adapting to climate change and contributing to lower emissions. And then at the same time, providing incomes to farmers and others along the food chain. And what I want to do is just talk a little bit about some of those challenges. What are the current trends in Latin America as we identify them in this year's Outlook, and then conclude on some issues for policymakers. Just broadly speaking, yes, there's a supply side challenge, And Holger described a situation where we do see demand slowing over the next 10 years. But it's also true that because of Latin America's comparative advantage, that the region, and Brazil in particular, will be increasingly important suppliers to that region. So the question is, can that be achieved sustainably? And this triple challenge that we're referring to, it's a complex policy issue. It involves synergies, because you may get benefits from pursuing one objective in terms of another objective, but it also involves trade-offs. So if we take food security, nutrition, resource use and climate change, and then livelihoods, we can see that we can get a benefit, for example, if we have healthier diets. That may actually be a way that we could reduce emissions. That could promote some kind of win-win. But at the same time, many people require more protein, not less. And if we reduce livestock numbers, that could potentially threaten protein availability. So that's a potential trade-off. Between food security and nutrition, if we generate and improve farmers' incomes, that could generate a double win in terms of better livelihoods and improved nutrition too. But obviously there can be a trade-off as well between higher farm incomes that come when prices are high, and that could also be detrimental to consumers. So there's trade-offs as well. And then across the environment and livelihoods, if we pay farmers for the provision of public goods, that can provide a double win. But if we start pricing water and land for their sustainable use, then that could involve trade-offs. And I think one of the key points that we would say in a Latin American context is livestock sector is really at the heart of some of those particular synergies and trade-offs. And the future of livestock is something that I think there's a lot of global concern about at the moment. So coming to where we are on these kind of three challenges, one of the things that we're seeing is progress across the world in reducing the number of people who are undernourished, but still far from satisfactory and still not enough to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. There's been steady progress over the last 15 years in Latin America, and our projections, we can actually project these numbers forward, and we would continue to see that improved food availability, a relatively low price environment should improve the availability and access to food, but again, it won't be sufficient to eliminate hunger. And yet, across the world, what we're also seeing is increases in the number of people who are overweight and obese. And I think it's a remarkable fact that there is, as far as we're aware, no country in the world that has succeeded in reversing this trend. And if we look at Latin America and the Caribbean, we see the changes there are concerning, to say the least. And in fact, the percentage of people who are overweight or obese in Latin America and the Caribbean is broadly the same as what we see in high-income countries overall. If we look at changes in diet structure, we've got a few snapshots over time intervals. See the share of the share of calories coming from sugar on the horizontal axis and the share coming from fat on the vertical axis. This was a change that Holger alluded to. And what we see over time is an increase in the proportion of calories that are coming from fat. And you can see that also in Latin America. So that's moving up. Incidentally, there's actually quite little change in sugar consumption, which would perhaps surprise some. Looking at protein, what we see is that Latin America, protein availability overall in Latin America is higher than in other continents, but not as high as in Europe, and interestingly not as high as in China, where consumption of protein is already quite high. And I think this was one of the global points that Holger was making as well, that there's been a rapid catch-up in terms of animal consumption in China, and whether that can be sustained at the same rate over the next decade is highly questionable. So Latin America is a bit behind China, but the share of protein coming from meat and fish is higher than elsewhere. In terms of what's going to happen to production, what we see is that there will be some opportunities to increase agricultural area within Latin America and the Caribbean region. The area numbers there include some double cropping, but still, broadly speaking, Latin America is the only region where there is additional cropland that can be brought into production. There's virtually no scope overall, relatively speaking, elsewhere in other regions. But even so, the increases in production don't come so much from the increase in area. The increases in production come by far, in the majority of cases, from increases in yield, not increases in area. The exception to that is soybeans to some extent, and cotton as well. Now, the beef sector in Latin America, as you can see from this picture, remains a major source of global agricultural emissions. And in our outlook projections, we have the emissions intensity of production decreasing, but still overall emissions continuing to rise as production increases, because the emissions intensity isn't falling quickly enough to offset that. Holger made the point that Latin America will remain the world's foremost food supplier, and this was the point we were making, that even if the overall market rate of growth is slowing, that will be tempered in the case of Latin America because of its comparative advantage in supplying that market. But even so, across the region, there are big differences and contrasting cereal balances across countries. So we see large surpluses on cereals in Brazil and Argentina, but net imports in a number of other Latin American countries. So regional trade in supplying that market will be important. With relatively weak demand growth, what we are projecting is a central tendency to flat to declining, slightly declining real prices. Now, Abby made the point in his remarks that one of the concerns he had was about noise in markets. But we see that this signal of flat to declining prices is a key feature that policymakers should be responding to, and we need to be very careful with a lot of volatility around that trend, that policies don't respond primarily to the noise, but have policies that respond to evolving market conditions. One thing is that with relatively weak demand growth, I think it's fair to say that yes, there's a need to increase production, but there's a window through which it's not necessary to increase production and open the taps at all costs. It's also possible to emphasize sustainability as well as increasing production. One of the worries of seeing an outlook for flat to declining real prices is the temptation that policymakers may have to respond by providing price support to maintain the prices that farmers receive, rather than help them be competitive in a lower price environment. What we see for Latin America as a whole, and this is taking some of our numbers but also some from our colleagues at the Inter-American Development Bank, is that support varies quite a lot across the Latin America region. You'll see it's particularly low at just 2 or 3% of farm receipts in the case of Brazil. But broadly speaking, support for agriculture in the region provided to farmers either in the form of higher prices or through subsidies of various kinds is less important than in the OECD area on average. So farmers in Latin America, on balance, are responding more to market signals than they are to signals that are given through government policies. So just a few conclusions then. On food security and nutrition, the LAC region has a growing problem of overweight and obesity that's becoming a significant public policy concern. Looking internationally, the region will continue to be a foremost supplier of food to deficit regions and a region that ensures global food security in that sense. On resource use and climate change, one thing that we conclude in the report is that the region has the scope and the potential to increase production sustainably and to reduce emissions. Whether that happens depends on the policies that are implemented, and the issue there is, again, implementation, evaluation. It's not simply about policies being on the books. And then in the case of livelihoods, we see rising opportunities for agriculture, including some smallholder operations. And we do have some discussion of specific opportunities for smallholder farmers in higher value segments. But in a lower price and a slow growth environment, we think it's important that policymakers prioritize productivity enhancing investment over support and protection, which may provide temporary relief to farmers' incomes, but doesn't really address the fundamental issue of their competitive and their long-term viability in the sector. So I think with that, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. I have my contact slide as well, but that's okay.
All right, thank you very much. That's a lot of food for thought. I'm sure there's quite a few questions from the crowd. And I think we're going to bring Peter and Shirley up as well. So people have any questions for any of the panelists, please feel free to write them down and we can ask the panelists. This is your chance to ask the experts the tough questions. I guess I'll start with Jesus. I'm sure you have a question that you'd like to ask the panelists here.
Oh, reflections. I don't have any specific question. Only what I could say after listen the last panelist is the power of Mercosur if it is working well.
All right, Jesus had a question about Mercosur. Does anyone wish to delve in on that?
I think, thanks. I think this was a comment more than really a question. And I think the point is well taken. I had that picture showing diverse cereal balances, really quite heterogeneous agriculture across the region, and that should be reflected in rising opportunities for interregional trade. So I think that point is well taken.
Parabéns a todos os panelistas. Eu e o Otávio aqui do IBGE temos uma questão que nos chamou a atenção, talvez pudesse até voltar o slide para o Jonathan Brooks. Vou esperar ele botar aqui o... Eu e o Otávio temos uma dúvida em relação à apresentação. Nos chamou a atenção a emissão causada pelos rebanhos da América Latina em comparação aos da Ásia, né? O número nos pareceu assim, um pouco elevado para essa divisão, principalmente em comparação com o tamanho do rebanho bovino que nós temos na Índia e dos problemas que nós temos com a emissão também do problema da pecuária suína nos países asiáticos. Queria que você, se pudesse, explicasse um pouco melhor isso aí para a gente. Obrigado.
I had a feeling I might hit a nerve with that with that particular issue. I think there is a huge issue where Latin America is obviously a competitive producer and supplier of beef products to the rest of the world. The emissions intensity will, of course, be lower than in countries like India, where the productivity is much lower, and the herds are very big, and the animals are not got to slaughter so quickly, and in many cases, there's a problem with killing the animals as well. So the emissions intensity might be relatively low, but still, the direct emissions are, because of the size of the herd, are quite important. And then the other big issue, we quantify that at the moment. We have the direct emissions that are quantified in our model, and the emissions intensity will come down also as productivity improves as well. So that's projected in what we have. But the big factor is accounting for land use change and what happens to land use change over the period, and what therefore happens to indirect emissions. So that's something that we're still in the process of quantifying, and we'll be keeping an eye on that with the numbers as they develop. I think it's just part of the tension that I really wanted to emphasize, that there is a demand for protein, there is a rising demand for beef. You may have a relatively low emissions intensity. You may also have an improving emissions intensity, and there may be a latent demand for protein across the world, which would say, well, okay, so Brazil can supply the world with beef products, but still, it will imply, and it's likely to imply, rising overall emissions in the process of meeting that demand. And I think that, viewed internationally, is a major global policy issue. It's not something that is just there's a one-off answer to. It's about trade-offs and social priorities among different issues. But I think this is just a very live issue about incomes for farmers, benefiting incomes for farmers, providing food security, providing protein, but also just acknowledging the fact that it will imply, most likely, rising emissions from the sector.
Thank you, Jonathan. We have another question right here. Go ahead, sir.
Primeiro, cumprimentá-los, né, pela brilhante exposição. Segundo, a pergunta que eu quero fazer vai para o Mr. Jonathan, mas, assim, ela tem um pouco de política, eu acho, e se ele não quiser responder, não tem problema. Nós temos aqui uma perseguição implacável à produção agrícola brasileira, tá? Seja em grupos internos e, sobretudo, de grupos externos. E nós estamos em vias de assinar um acordo já esperado há décadas, que é Brasil e União Europeia. E ontem, me parece que foi ontem, a ministra de Meio Ambiente da França, ela disse que não assinaria, ou não, né, a França não participaria desse acordo, não assinaria esse acordo do Brasil e União Europeia. Eu penso que por todas essas discussões recentes que teve, sobretudo entre Brasil e França, por questões ambientais, questão da Amazônia, né, e o entendimento nosso é que se faz uma leitura lá fora que não condiz com a realidade que você tem na produção agropecuária brasileira. Então, quem conhece a realidade de produção, tá, nesses últimos anos, eu penso que quem está mais preocupado mesmo na proteção ou na sustentabilidade da agropecuária é o próprio produtor que está ali produzindo. Então, se o senhor tem uma leitura sobre isso, conhecendo tão bem a realidade do Brasil, se o senhor tem uma leitura sobre isso, entendeu? Eu gostaria de saber a sua opinião, e se algum outro também dos painelistas quiser colocar, eu agradeceria. Obrigado.
Yeah, thanks very much for this question. In a way, I'm glad you asked it. I can't comment, of course, on the specifics of the politics, but it was really with that in mind that we put up this Venn diagram showing trade-offs across different areas, and we can try to quantify those things as best we can and give
an objective evaluation of trade-offs across different policy concerns. But the fundamental fact of the matter is that this isn't something that can just be programmed. It depends on social values, and it depends on trading across different policy priorities, and it depends on achieving some kind of social consensus on what is the appropriate trade-off between different objectives. And so it's with that in mind that we try to say, well, maybe we can put the evidence base into the public domain and have a good conversation about that, both domestically and internationally. Because I think I do take your point that a lot of what we hear is just negative. You know, that somehow the agricultural sector, oh, it's poisoning us all, it's making us fat, it's making a mess of the environment, it's leading to deforestation. But at the same time, it's a very negative view when farmers are still producing what feeds us, and as you say, they have a good knowledge of how to look after their own resources. So, and one of the concerns we have, in particular with respect to the issue of productivity, is that many times productivity growth is just saying, oh, this is productivist industrial agriculture, but with limited land available globally, if the increase in production doesn't come from productivity, where does it come from? So it's absolutely essential. So what we want to do is to just put some balanced evidence out into the international policy domain and have a discussion about some of these trade-offs rather than just polarized discussion of issues that will be about balancing concerns. I hope that's as diplomatic as I can be on that, and it doesn't get into the politics of it, but I hope that helps explain our perspective.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Marcello, did you have a couple questions from the crowd?
Sim, nós temos aqui duas perguntas, só que eu confesso que eu não estou conseguindo compreender muito bem. Não sei se as pessoas que fizeram podem se identificar para a gente levar até aí e fazer a pergunta oralmente. Tá. Eu vou pedir para... Eu não estou entendendo muito bem.
Bom dia, né? Para o Jonathan Brooks, sobre os alimentos vazios que você falou, das calorias, que afetam as commodities, sendo alterado para suprir a ausência de vitaminas e as políticas de modificação genética, como que afetaria o mercado a médio prazo em relação à modificação para adição de nutrientes e nesse setor. Assim. Eu acho que foi para o Jonathan Brooks, mas eu não tenho certeza. Eu acho que foi para ele.
Okay. Yeah, no, I was just looking at my FAO colleague here thinking that maybe we can split the answer. Oh, sorry. I was just thinking maybe we'd share the burden a bit with my FAO colleague, but do you want to? Okay. Okay. Yeah, because I mean, I think as Holger explained, we've got projections that keep policies constant, have evolving tastes and preferences that we try to pick up via expert judgment in terms of where things go. We had a graph showing undernourishment and what you might call overnourishment leading to overweight and obesity. But one of the trends that we are observing globally is also micronutrient deficiency, which is a major concern around the world. With GM, one of the big uncertainties is, I mean, there are rules on GM that are applied in different ways around the world, the way in which it currently enters markets. We we assume in our projections that that is all held constant, but it could evolve in very different ways. And one of the issues that we're particularly interested in is the potential for new plant breeding techniques to influence both the productivity side, but there are also opportunities on the demand side, including through biofortification and other approaches. So technology can have a major influence both on the supply side, but it can also have a major impact on the demand side. And by the way, on the supply side, again, there's a lot of potential, I think, in new plant breeding techniques. And so the regulatory environment will, of course, be absolutely critical in determining what happens there. I hope that helps a bit. Thank you.
It's in English. Okay, we have a question in English for the panel. What are your views about the Paris Agreement and its possible impacts on international agriculture trade in the short and medium term? And that would be our final question, because we're going to have to wrap up for lunch after this. Oh, Jonathan wants to answer this one too. He's on a roll.
It's a hugely important question. So I think one of the things is, it comes back perhaps to Wilson's comment about the future of livestock, where if you have this is a major uncertainty in terms of how it will play out. And I think it's one of those things, I don't have a straight answer for you, but everybody's looking for something that can provide national proxies for what would ideally be a global carbon tax to address the issue. And of course, the concern is that if you simply apply a tax to your own production and you don't affect consumption, then the production may occur somewhere where the emissions intensity is higher. So you can get perverse kinds of effects on policies as well. So we're actively looking at the kinds of policies that can encourage efficient production where the emissions intensity is lower.
Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you to the panelists, and thank you for the excellent questions. Do any of the panelists have any final thoughts, and then we'll wrap it up? We're good? All right, I guess we'll just break for lunch now, Marcello.
Agradecendo aos integrantes deste painel, com isso encerramos a primeira parte desta manhã do Seminário Internacional Desafios e Oportunidades para a Agricultura na América Latina. São 12 horas e 56 minutos. Faremos o intervalo para o almoço, que é livre, e retornaremos os trabalhos às 2 horas e 30 minutos. Boa tarde, bom almoço e até já. Senhores, só para confirmar, nós precisaremos começar às 2h30 em ponto, porque o participante do próximo painel, eu vou repetir para os nossos amigos congressistas internacionais. nós começaremos a segunda parte às 2h30 em ponto, porque um dos participantes do próximo painel tem horário de voo agendado. Muito obrigado.